They believe that these things are simply means used to convey the false impression that he was capable of directing the state. In my opinion, by conversations of this kind, he discouraged his associates from even making pretensions. Book 2. It seems to me that Socrates also encouraged his associates to practice self-discipline with regard to food and drink and sex and sleep and heat and cold and physical exertion by discourses like the one which follows. When he observed that one of his associates was rather undisciplined in these respects, he said, "Tell me, Aristippus, one, if you had to take charge of 2 young men and educate them, one to be capable of governing and the other not even to aspire to it, how would you educate each of them? Would you like us to consider this problem by starting with the basic question of their food?" Aristippus replied, "It certainly seems to me that food is the starting point. One can't even live without taking food, so it's natural that both of them should feel the desire to partake of food when the right time comes, isn't it?" 1. Yes, it is. Which of them should we accustom to choose to press on with an urgent duty rather than gratify his? Definitely the one who is being educated to govern, so that the business of the state may not be neglected under his government. Then similarly when they want to drink, the same one must be endowed with the ability to restrain himself when he's thirsty, certainly. Which should we endow with self-discipline as regards sleep, so that he can go to bed late and get up early and stay awake if need be. 1. The same one ought to have this too. What about not shirking hard work, but willingly putting up with it? Which should we endow with this quality? We should give this also to the one who is being educated for government. What about acquiring any kind of knowledge that is conducive to defeating one's opponents? To which would this faculty be more appropriate? 1. Far more, of course, to the one who is being educated for government. None of the other qualities is any good without this sort of knowledge. Don't you think that a person so educated would be less likely than other creatures to be caught by his opponents? Some creatures, as you know, are lured on by their greed, and are often attracted to the bait, in spite of their timidity, by their craving for food, and so get caught, while others are trapped by means of drink. Quite true. And isn't it true that others are trapped because of their lasciviousness, as for example quails and partridges are attracted by the cry of the female because of their desire and expectation of sexual intercourse and, losing all count of the risks, rush into the hunting nets? He agreed that this was true too. Don't you think that it's shameful for a man to be affected in the same way as the stupidest of creatures? I'm thinking of the way in which adulterers walk into the snare, although they know that an adulterer is in danger not only of incurring the penalty threatened by the laws, but of having a trap set for him and, if he is caught, of suffering physical violence. When the adulterer is liable to all these serious and shameful consequences, and there are plenty of means to relieve his sexual appetite with impunity, nevertheless to rush headlong into the paths of danger isn't at the very acme of infatuation. One thing so he said is most of the essential human activities, such as those which relate to warfare and farming, and not the least important of the rest are carried out in the open air. Don't you think that it is extremely irresponsible for most people to be untrained to endure cold and heat? He agreed to this too. Then, do you think that the prospective ruler ought also to practice enduring these things easily? Certainly, he said. Then, if we rate those who are self-disciplined in all these respects as fit to govern, shall we rate those who are incapable of such conduct as not even claiming fitness to do so? He agreed again. Very well. Then, now that you know the rating of both types, I suppose you have considered to which class you would rightly assign yourself. Have indeed, said Aristippus, and I certainly don't put myself in the class of those who want to govern. In fact, considering that it's a serious task to provide for one's own needs, it seems to me to be quite crazy not to be content with this, but to pile on top of it the task of supplying the needs of the rest of one's fellow citizens as well. And when a person has to do without a great many things that he wants himself, surely it's the height of folly, by assuming responsibility for his country, to render himself liable to prosecution if he doesn't carry out all his country's requirements. States claim the right to treat their ministers as I treat the slaves in my own household. I'll expect my servants to make lavish provision for me, but not to touch anything themselves. And in the same way, states think that their ministers ought to provide them with as many benefits as possible without participating in any of them personally. So if there are any people who want to have a lot of trouble themselves and cause it to others, I would educate them in that manner and set them in the category of potential rulers. But I rank myself among those who want their lives to be as easy and pleasant as possible. Socrates said, would you like us to consider this question too, who have the more pleasant life, the rulers or the subjects? By all means. Well, in the first place, of the peoples that we know, in Asia the Persians are rulers and the Syrians, Phrygians and Lydians are subjects. In Europe the Scythians are rulers and the Maeotian subjects. In Africa the Carthaginians are rulers and the Libyan subjects. Who of these do you think have the pleasanter life? Or take the Greeks, to whom you belong yourself, who seem to you to have the pleasanter life, the conquerors or the conquered? But, you know, said Aristippus, don't assign myself to the slave category either. It seems to me that there is a middle path which I'm trying to follow, the path not through rule nor through servitude, but through liberty, which is the surest road to happiness. Well, said Socrates, if this path of yours that avoids rule and servitude avoids mankind also, there may perhaps be something in what you say. But if while living among men you expect neither to rule nor to be ruled, and don't intend to defer willingly to authority, I presume you can see that the stronger know how to make the weaker suffer both collectively and individually, and to treat them as slaves. Don't you realize that there are people who cut the corn that others have sown, and chop down the trees that others have planted, and put every kind of pressure upon inferiors who refuse them deference, until they finally prevail on them to prefer slavery to war against a stronger power? And in private life too, don't you know that the bold and powerful reduce the timid and powerless to slavery, and then exploit them? But I have an escape, he said. To avoid being treated this way, I don't confine myself to a nationality at all. I am a stranger in all countries, Socrates replied. Now, that really is a clever stroke. Ever since Sinis and Cyrene and Procrustes were killed, nobody has done any harm to strangers. All the same, nowadays those who form the administration in their several countries pass laws to protect themselves against harm, and make friends, in addition to their so-called intimate friends, to give them help. They also put fortifications round their cities, acquire arms to keep off aggressors, and, besides all this, procure external allies as well. And with all these assets they still incur harm. As for you, who have none of these assets, and spend a great deal of time in the streets, where most injuries are sustained, you who, whatever country you visit, are in a weaker position than any of the citizens, and a natural victim for intending wrongdoers, do you still imagine that you would not be harmed, because you are a stranger? Is your confidence based on official assurances of safety as you travel here and there in the country? Or is it based on the belief that you are the sort of person who would be useless as a slave to any master? I mean, who would care to have in his house a man who refuses to do any work and enjoys the most expensive diet? Now let us consider another point. What sort of treatment slaves of this kind receive? Isn't it true that their masters discipline their wantonness by starvation, and stop them from stealing by locking up any place or receptacle from which anything can be removed, and prevent them from running away by putting them in fetters, and drive out their idleness by beating them? Or what steps do you take when you discover that one of your house slaves is behaving in this sort of way? 1. Punish him with the utmost severity until I have made him submit. But look here, Socrates, about these people who are being educated in the art of ruling, which you seem to regard as happiness, how are they any better off than those who suffer through force of circumstances, if they are going to be hungry and thirsty and cold and sleepless and to suffer every other kind of hardship voluntarily? I don't see that there is any difference between having the same skin flogged voluntarily and having it flogged involuntarily, or in general that there is any difference between having the same body harassed by all these trials voluntarily and having it harassed involuntarily, except that anyone who submits to painful experiences deliberately is a fool into the bargain. Come, Aristippus, said Socrates, don't you think that voluntary sufferings of this kind are preferable to involuntary ones from this point of view, that the man who is hungry or thirsty of his own free will can eat and drink when he wants to, and similarly in the other cases, whereas the man who suffers through force of circumstances can't stop the suffering when he wants to. And then the man who undergoes hardship voluntarily is encouraged in his efforts by the prospect of success, as, for example, hunters enjoy their exertions because they have a prospect of catching the animals that they are hunting. This sort of reward for effort is trivial. But when people devote their energy to acquiring good friends or worsting their enemies, or becoming physically and mentally efficient and managing their estates well and benefiting their friends and serving their country, surely we must suppose that they find pleasure in working for these ends, and enjoy life, contented with themselves and praised and envied by others. Again, easy tasks and momentary pleasures cannot produce physical fitness, as the experts in physical education remind us, or develop in the mind any knowledge worth mentioning. Sustained application, however, enables us to achieve truly good results, as good men tell us. Hesiod says somewhere, evil can be easily found and freely. Smooth is the road, and very near she dwells, but sweat the gods have set upon the way to goodness. Long and steep is the path to it and rough at first. But if you reach the summit thereafter it is easy, hard though it was. Epicharmus testifies the same in the line, pains the price the gods require us to pay for all our benefits, and he also says in another place, rascal, do not crave for comfort, lest the lot you have be hard. The same view of moral goodness is also set out by the sophist Prodicus in the story of Heracles, which is one of his most popular displays. It runs like this, as far as I remember. When Heracles was setting out from childhood towards manhood, at the age when the young become independent and show whether they are going to approach life by the path of goodness or by the path of wickedness, he went out to a quiet spot and sat down, considering which way he should take. While he was sitting there, he thought he saw two women approach him. Both were tall, but one of them was handsome in appearance with a natural air of distinction, clean-limbed and modest in expression, and soberly dressed in a white robe, while the other was well fed to the point of fleshiness and softness, made up to have a complexion too red and white to be real, and with a carriage more upright than was natural, with a brazen expression, and robed in a way that revealed as much as possible of her charms. She kept on examining herself, and watching to see if anyone was looking at her, and glancing at her own shadow when they got nearer to Heracles. The first of the two continued to advance in the same way, but the other, wishing to forestall her, ran up to him and said, Heracles, I see that you can't make up your mind which way of life to adopt. If you take me as your friend, I will lead you by the easiest and pleasantest road. You shall not miss the taste of any pleasure, and you shall live out your life without any experience of hardship in the first place. You will not be concerned with wars or responsibilities. You shall constantly consider what food or drink you can find to suit your taste, and what sight or sound or scent or touch might please you, and which lover's society will gratify you most, and how you can sleep most comfortably, and how you can achieve all these objects with the least trouble. And if there is ever any suspicion of a shortage of any of these benefits, you need not fear that I shall involve you in any physical or mental effort or distress in procuring them. You shall enjoy the fruits of other people's labors, and you shall refrain from nothing from which you can derive any advantage, because I'll authorize my followers to benefit themselves from all quarters." When Heracles heard this, he asked, "What is your name, lady?" She replied, "My friends call me Happiness, but people who don't like me nickname me Vice." Meanwhile, the other woman came forward and said, "I too have come to meet you, Heracles, because I know your parents and I have carefully observed your natural qualities in the course of your education, and this knowledge makes me hope that, if you will only take the path that leads to me, you may become a very effective performer of fine and noble deeds, and I may win much greater honor still, and brighter glory for the blessings I bestow. I will not delude you with promises of future pleasure. I shall give you a true account of the facts, exactly as the gods have ordained them. Nothing that is really good and admirable is granted by the gods to men without some effort and application. If you want the gods to be gracious to you, you must worship the gods. If you wish to be loved by your friends, you must be kind to your friends. If you desire to be honored by a state, you must help that state. If you expect to be admired for your fine qualities by the whole of Greece, you must try to benefit Greece. If you want your land to produce abundant crops, you must look after your land. If you expect to make money from your livestock, you must take care of your livestock. If you have an impulse to extend your influence by war, and want to be able to free your friends and subdue your enemies, you must both learn the actual arts of war from those who understand them, and practice the proper way of applying them. And if you want to be physically efficient, you must train your body to be subject to your reason, and develop it with hard work and sweat." Here Vice, as Prodicus tells, broke in. "Do you realize, Heracles," she said, "what a long and difficult road to enjoyment this woman is describing to you? I will put you on a short and easy road to happiness." "Imprudent creature." 11 said Virtue. "What good have you to offer, or what do you know of pleasure, you who refuse to do anything with a view to either? You don't even wait for the desire for what is pleasant, you stuff yourself with everything before you want it, eating before you are hungry and drinking before you are thirsty. To make eating enjoyable you invent refinements of cookery, and to make drinking enjoyable, you provide yourself with expensive wines and rush about searching for ice in summer. To make going to sleep pleasant, you provide yourself not only with soft blankets, but also with bases for your beds, for it is not work but boredom that makes you want to go to bed. You force the gratification of your sexual impulses before they ask for it, employing all kinds of devices and treating men as women. That is the sort of training that you give your friends, exciting their passions by night, and putting them to sleep for the best part of the day. Although you are immortal, you have been turned out by the gods, and you are despised by decent men. You are denied the hearing of the sweetest of all sounds, praise of yourself, and you are denied the seeing of the sweetest of all sights, for you have never contemplated any act of yours that was admirable. Who would trust your word? Who would assist you if you needed someone? What sane person would have the face to join your devotees? When they are young, they are feeble in body, and when they get older, they are foolish in mind. They are maintained in their youth in effortless comfort, but pass their old age in laborious squalor, disgraced by their past actions and burdened by their present ones, because in their youth they have run through all that was pleasant, and laid up for their old age what is hard. To bear L associate both with gods and with good men, and no fine action, human or divine, is done independently of me. L am held in the highest honor both among gods and men who are akin to me. L am a welcome fellow worker to the craftsman, a faithful guardian to the householder, a kindly protector to the servant, an efficient helper in the tasks of peace, a staunch ally in the operations of war, and the best partner in friendship. My friends can enjoy food and drink with pleasure and without effort, because they abstain until they feel a desire for them. Their sleep is sweeter than the sleep of the easy living, and they neither are vexed when they have to give it up, nor make it an excuse for neglecting their duty. The young enjoy the praise of their elders, and the older people are happy in the respect of the young. They recall their past achievements with pleasure, and rejoice in their present successes, because through me they are dear to the gods, loved by their friends and honored by their country. And when their appointed end comes, they do not lie forgotten in obscurity, but flourish celebrated in memory for all time there. Heracles, she said, child of good parents, if you work hard in the way that I have described, you can possess the most beatific happiness. That is roughly how Prodicus describes the education of Heracles by Virtue, except that he actually dressed up the sentiments in language still more splendid than I have used now. At any rate, Aristippus, you had better think this over and try to take some account of the factors that will affect the life that lies in front of you. Once, when Socrates noticed his eldest son Lamprocles getting angry with his mother, he said, "Look here, my boy, you know that there are some people who are called ungrateful." "Yes, of course," said the boy. "Are you clear about what it is that people do to earn this name?" "Yes, LM," he said. "People are called ungrateful when they have been well treated and could show gratitude in return, but don't. Then you think that ingratitude is regarded as yes, I do. Have you ever considered this question, whether perhaps ingratitude is wrong if it is shown towards friends, but right if it is shown towards enemies, in the same way that it is considered to be wrong to enslave one's friends, but right to enslave one's enemies?" "Yes, indeed," he replied, "and I think that anyone who has received a favor either from a friend or from an enemy and doesn't attempt to show gratitude is morally wrong. Well then, if that is so, ingratitude must be unmitigated injustice." Lamprocles agreed. Then the greater the favors that a person receives without showing gratitude in return, the more unjust he admitted this too. Well, said Socrates, whom can we find that enjoy greater benefits than children receive from their parents? Their parents have brought them into existence from non-existence, and have enabled them to see all the beauty and sharing all the good things that the gods provide for mankind, privileges which we consider so priceless that anyone would do anything rather than part with them, and states have made death a penalty for the greatest crimes, on the presumption that there could be no stronger deterrent from wrongdoing. You don't imagine that people have children just for sexual satisfaction. The streets and brothels are full of potential suppliers of that need. Besides, you can see that we look out for the sort of women who will bear us the best children, and then unite with them to produce children. The husband both supports his partner in childbearing and provides for the children that are to be born everything that he thinks will be an asset to them in life, and he provides it as fully as he can. The wife conceives and carries this burden, bearing the weight of it, risking her life and giving up a share of her own nourishment. And after all her trouble in carrying it for the full time and bringing it to birth, she feeds and cares for it, although the child has never done her any good and does not know who his benefactor is. He cannot even communicate what he wants. His mother's attempts to supply what will be good for him and give him pleasure depend upon her powers of guessing. And she goes on rearing him for a long time, putting up with drudgery day and night, without knowing whether she will receive any gratitude. And it is not merely a matter of rearing children when they seem to be capable of learning. Their parents teach them themselves whatever they can teach that is valuable for life. But if they think that there is anything that is better taught by somebody else, they incur the expense of sending their children to that person. They leave nothing undone in their concern to see that their children's development is as perfect as possible. To this the lad replied, but really, even if she has done all this and a great deal more besides, nobody could put up with her temper. Which kind of ferocity do you think is harder to bear, a wild beast's or a mother's? A mother's, he said. If she's like mine, has she ever injured you by biting or kicking, as a good many people have suffered before now from wild animals? 1. Oh no, he said, but she says things that one wouldn't want to hear every day of one's life. And how much trouble, said Socrates, do you think you have given her by your peevish cries and behavior day and night ever since you were a baby? And how often have you worried her by your illnesses? 1. Well, said Lamprocles, one have never said or done anything to her to make her ashamed of me. Look here, said Socrates, do you think it is harder for you to listen to the things that she says than it is for actors in tragedies when they go all out to abuse one another? 1. Well, they don't imagine that the speaker who accuses them intends to punish them, or that the one who threatens them intends to injure them, so I suppose they take it quite lightly. Boo-to get angry, although you know quite well that what your mother says to you is said not only without any unkind intention, but actually out of a desire for your especial benefit? Or do you imagine that your mother is ill-disposed towards you? 1. Oh no, he said, one don't think that, so, said Socrates, although this mother of yours is well disposed towards you, and does her very best to see to it that you get well when you are ill and that you shan't lack anything that you need. And besides all this, although she is constantly praying to the gods for blessings upon you and paying her vows on your account, you say that she is hard to put up with. In my opinion, if you can't bear a mother like that, you can't bear what is good for you. Tell me, do you think that there is anyone else who claims your respect? Or is there nobody you are prepared to try to please or obey, be he your superior officer or anyone else in authority? 1. Of course that's not the case, he said. Well then, said Socrates, do you want to be pleasant to your neighbor, so that he may give you a light for your fire when you need it, and both contribute to your success and give you prompt and friendly help if you meet with any misfortune? 1. Yes, I do. Take the case of a fellow traveler or fellow voyager, or anyone else you might meet. Would it make no difference to you whether he became your friend or your enemy? Do you think that you ought to concern yourself with the goodwill of people like these? 1. Do think so you are prepared to concern yourself with these people, and yet see no need to show consideration for your mother, who loves you more than anyone else does. Don't you know that the state cares nothing for any other kind of ingratitude, and prescribes no penalty for it, but turns a blind eye when beneficiaries fail to repay a favor? But if anyone shows no consideration for his parents, the state imposes a penalty upon him and disqualifies him from holding public office, on the presumption that the sacrifices could not be performed on behalf of the state with proper piety if he performed them, nor any other act be well and duly carried out if he were the agent. And what is more, if anyone fails to tend the graves of his dead parents, even this becomes the subject of a state inquiry when candidates for office are having their conduct scrutinized. So if you are sensible, my boy, you will beseech the gods to pardon any disregard that you have shown towards your mother in case they count you as ungrateful and refuse to do you good. And at the same time you will take care that your fellow men don't observe you neglecting your parents and all lose respect for you, so that you stand revealed as destitute of friends. For if they once got the notion that you were ungrateful to your parents, none would expect gratitude in return for doing you a kindness. On another occasion, Xenophon and Socrates, two brothers with whom Socrates was well acquainted, were having a quarrel. Socrates became aware of this, and, when he saw Socrates, he said, "Tell me, Socrates, surely you aren't one of those who think that possessions are more useful than a brother? Although they are not endowed with sense and he is, and they need protection whereas he can give it, and, what is more, they are many while he is only one. It is extraordinary too, that anyone should regard brothers as a liability because he doesn't possess their property as well as his own, and not regard his fellow citizens as a liability on the same ground. since in the one case people can reason that it is better to have a secure sufficiency and live in a group than to have precarious possession of all their fellow citizens, property and life alone, it is curious that they fail to realize the same fact in the case of their brothers. And they buy house slaves, if they can afford it, to help them with the work, and they make friends, showing that they feel the need for support. And yet they show no interest in their brothers, as if they expected their fellow citizens to be friendly, but not their brothers. Then again, it's a powerful incentive to affection to have been born of the same parents and brought up together. Even animals develop a kind of strong attachment for members of the same litter. Besides, the rest of mankind have a greater respect for those who have brothers, and are less likely to attack them. Socrates replied, "Well, Socrates, if the quarrel weren't a serious one, very likely it would be right to bear with one's brother and not shun him for petty reasons. As you say, a brother is an asset if he behaves as he should. But when he is deficient in every respect, and the exact opposite of what he ought to be, why should one attempt the impossible? One tell me," Socrates said Socrates, "is Xenophon as incapable of getting on with anybody as he is with you, or are there some people with whom he gets on quite well?" "That's precisely my ground for disliking him, Socrates," he replied. "He can be agreeable to other people, but in all his associations with me, in word and in deed, he's more of a liability than an asset." "Well," said Socrates, "a horse is a liability to a person who tries to manage it without having enough knowledge. Perhaps in the same way a brother is liability when one tries to manage him without knowledge." "How can I not have the knowledge to manage a brother," said Socrates, "when I know how to speak and behave civilly to those who are civil to me? But when a man does his best to annoy me by what he says and does, I can't speak or behave civilly to him, and I'm not going to try either." "That's a queer thing to say," Socrates said Socrates. "If you had a trained sheepdog which was friendly to the shepherds, but resented it when you came near, you would pay no attention to its bad temper, you would try to win it over by kindness. You say that your brother would be a great asset to you if he treated you properly. You admit that you know how to behave and speak civilly. Yet you don't attempt to find a way to make him as well disposed towards you as possible." "I'm afraid," Socrates said Socrates, "that I'm not enough of a genius to make Xenophon behave properly to me." "One assure you," said Socrates, "so far as I can see, you needn't employ any subtle or novel method on him. I think you could prevail on him to have a high regard for you by using means which you understand yourself. If you have detected that I am the unconscious possessor of some magic formula," he replied, "you can't tell me to." "Quickly, tell me," then said Socrates, "if you wanted to prevail upon one of your acquaintances to invite you to dinner whenever he was holding a celebration, what would you do?" "One obviously I should begin by inviting him when I was celebrating, and if you wanted to induce one of your friends to take care of your property when you were away from home, what would you do?" "One obviously I should first try to take care of his when he was away. And if you wanted to make a foreigner give you hospitality when you visited his country, what would you do?" "One obviously I should first give him hospitality when he came to Athens. And if I wanted him to be eager to achieve the object of my visit for me, obviously I should have first to do the same for him. So you know all the magic spells that influence human conduct, and have kept your knowledge dark all this time. Why do you hesitate to begin? Are you afraid that you will look bad if you treat your brother well before he treats you well? Surely it is considered to be extremely creditable to take the lead in harming one's enemies and benefiting one's friends. If I had thought that Xenophon was likelier than you to take the lead towards friendliness, I should have tried to persuade him first to try to win you over. But as it is, I think that you are the more likely to take the lead in achieving this result." Socrates said, "It is preposterous, Socrates, and not at all like you, to urge me, the younger brother, to take the lead. Why, the universal practice is just the opposite, that the older should take the lead in everything that is said or done." "Surely not," said Socrates. "Isn't it customary in all countries for the younger to make way for the older, and to stand up when he approaches, and to show respect for him by giving him the most comfortable seat, and to allow him to speak first? Don't hold back, my dear fellow, but try to pacify him, and he will very soon respond. Don't you see what a noble and generous nature he has? Low types of humanity are most likely to be won over by a gift. But the best way to influence truly good people is by courtesy," Socrates said. "Supposing that I do what you recommend, and he shows no improvement?" "One in that case," said Socrates, "you will simply run the risk of demonstrating that you are a good and affectionate brother, and he is a bad one who doesn't deserve to be treated kindly. But I don't suppose that anything of the sort will happen. I think that when he once realizes that you are challenging him to this kind of contest, he will be very keen to outdo you in kindness, both spoken and practical. At the moment your attitude towards each other is like this, as if two hands which God created to cooperate with each other were to give up doing this and turn to hindering each other. Or as if 2 feet designed by Providence to help each other were to neglect their duty and get in each other's way. Wouldn't it be great folly and perversity to use for our disadvantage what was intended for our benefit? And yet, so far as I can see, brothers were intended by God to be more helpful to each other than hands or feet or eyes or any other natural pairs with which He has supplied mankind. If the hands are required to perform simultaneously 2 operations more than 6 feet apart, they cannot do it. And the feet cannot reach simultaneously 2 points even 6 feet apart. And the eyes, which are supposed to have the greatest range, cannot see at the same time 2 objects at a still lesser distance. If one object is in front and the other behind, but a pair of brothers, if they are on good terms, can carry out 2 simultaneous operations at a great distance to their mutual advantage. I once heard Socrates expressing views about friendship which I thought would be extremely helpful to anyone in the acquisition and treatment of friends. He said that although he often heard it stated that a good and sure friend was the best of all possessions, he noticed that most people gave their attention to anything rather than the acquisition of friends. He saw that they took pains to acquire houses and lands and slaves and cattle and furniture, and tried to preserve what they had. But in the case of a friend, who according to them was the greatest blessing, most of them never considered either how to acquire one or how to retain those that they had. Indeed, he noticed, he said, that some people, when their friends and servants were ill, called in the doctor and scrupulously made all the other provisions for the health of their servants, but neglected their Ephrains. And that when friends and servants died, they grieved over their servants and felt a sense of loss, but in the case of their friends considered that they were none the worse. And that they allowed none of their other possessions to lack attention and supervision, but neglected their friends when they needed care further. Besides all this, he noticed, he said, that most people knew the quantity of their other possessions, even if they were very numerous, but as for their friends, few as they were, they not only did not know how many they had, but when they tried to furnish an inventory in answer to inquiry, they revised their opinion of those whom they had previously reckoned as friends, which showed how much they thought about Ephrains yet. If we compare a good friend with any other possession, it must be obvious that the friend is far superior. What horse or vehicle is as valuable as a staunch friend? What slave is as loyal and trusty? What other possession is so thoroughly useful? A good Ephraim sets himself to supply all his friends' deficiencies, whether of private property or of public service. If it is required to do someone a good turn, he lends vigorous support. If some fear is causing anxiety, he comes to the rescue. As the occasion demands, he shares expense, joins in action, helps to persuade, or uses compulsion. He is equally effective in cheering on the successful and in raising up those who stumble. A friend is just as much a benefactor to a man as are the hands that work for him, the eyes that see for him, the ears that hear for him and the feet that carry him. Often one friend supplies for another something which that other has failed to do or see or hear or carry out himself. And yet although some people try to cultivate trees for the sake of their fruit, most are indolent and negligent in taking care of the most productive of all possessions, what we call a friend. One day I heard another discourse of his which I thought stimulated anyone who heard it to examine himself and see what he was worth to his friends. He saw that one of his associates was neglecting a friend who was distressed by poverty, and he questioned Antisthenes in the presence of the neglectful person and of several others. Antisthenes, he said, do friends have values, in the same way that domestic slaves do? For instance, one slave, I suppose, is worth 2 minae, and another not as much as half a mina, and another 5 minae and another 10 minae. And they say that Nicias, the son of Niceratus, bought an overseer of his silver mine for a talent. What I am trying to discover is whether friends have their values too, like domestic slaves. Yes, indeed, replied Antisthenes. At any rate, I would rather have A as my friend than 2 minae, while I wouldn't rate B higher than half a mina. And I would choose C in preference to 10 minae, and I wouldn't spend any amount of money and effort to obtain the friendship of D. Very well, then said Socrates, if the facts are as you say, it would be well for a man to examine himself and see what he really is worth to his friends, and to try to be worth as much as possible to them, so that his friends may be less likely to let him down. You see, I have often heard one person say that a friend has let him down, and another say that a man who he thought was his friend has preferred a mina to him. And that is why I am investigating the whole question. Perhaps, just as one offers a bad slave for sale and disposes of him for what he will fetch, in the same way there is a temptation to sell a bad friend when one can get a price greater than his value. But in my experience there is no more question of giving up a good friend than of selling a good slave. I thought that in the following conversation he was giving instruction about estimating what sort of friends it was worthwhile to make. Tell me, Critobulus, he said, if we wanted a good friend, how should we set about our search? Should we first look for a man who can control his desires for food and drink and sex and sleep and idleness? For the man who is a slave to these can't do his duty either to himself or to a friend. No, of course he can't. So you think that one should keep away from people who are governed by their desires? One certainly. Well now, said Socrates, if a man is extravagant and can't meet all his expenses, but is always appealing to his neighbors, and if, when he gets a loan, he can't repay it, and, when he doesn't get one, he bears a grudge against the person who refused it, don't you think that this man too is a difficult sort of friend? Yes, indeed, so one should keep away from him too? Yes, one should. What about the good businessman who is bent on making a great deal of money and consequently drives a hard bargain, and who enjoys receiving money but is reluctant to part with it? 1. In my view, he said, this one is even worse than the last. What about the man who has such a passion for making money that he has no time for anything that won't turn to his own profit? 1. He should be avoided too, in my opinion. He will be no use to anyone who associates with him. What about the troublemaker who wants to stir up a lot of bad feeling against his friends? 1. He certainly should be given a wide berth too, and supposing that someone, although he has none of these defects, accepts any amount of kindness and never thinks of repaying a good turn? 1. He would be no use either. But tell me, Socrates, what sort of person shall we try to make our friend? Presumably one who has the opposite qualities, who is self-disciplined with regard to physical pleasures, and who proves to be good at managing his own affairs, reliable in his dealings with others, and eager not to fall short in doing services to his benefactors, so that it is an advantage to associate with him. How can we test these qualities before we commit ourselves? Socrates. 1. We don't judge sculptors on the evidence of their claims, he said, but if we see that a man's earlier works are well executed, we assume that his future works will be of high quality too. Do you mean, asked Critobulus, that anyone who has clearly treated his past friends well will obviously do good to his subsequent friends too? 1. Yes, said Socrates, because, in the case of horses, if I see that someone has treated them well in the past, I assume that he is likely to treat other horses well too. Very good, he said. But when a man seems worthy of one's friendship, how should one set about making friends with him? 1. First of all, said Socrates, you must consider the will of the gods, and see whether they advise you to make friends with him. Well, then, supposing that we decide to make friends with someone and the gods raise no objection, can you tell me how to capture him? 1. Well, he said, certainly not by chasing him, as if he were a hare, nor by snaring him, as if he were a bird, nor by force, as one does one's enemies. It's hard work catching a friend against his will. And it's also difficult to keep him shackled like a slave. That sort of treatment is more likely to make enemies than friends. But how are friends made? 1. Asked Critobulus. They say that there are incantations which those who know them can use to win the friendship of anyone that they like. And drugs too, which can be used by those who understand them to make them loved by anyone that they like. Then how can we find out about them? 1. He asked, you have heard from Homer the incantation that the sirens uttered over Odysseus, which begins something like this: Come hither, famed Odysseus, great glory of the Greeks. Did the sirens utter this incantation over all the other victims of their charms too, to keep them from getting away? Asked Critobulus. No, they kept it for those who were eager for recognition of their bravery. What you're saying amounts practically to this, that in each case one should use an incantation designed so that the hearer won't think that he is being praised sarcastically. Yes. You would repel people and incur dislike instead of friendship, if you praised a man by calling him handsome and tall and strong, when he knew that he was short and ugly and weak. Do you know any other incantations? I know, but I have heard that Pericles knew a great many, which he used to utter over the state and so won its affection. How did Themistocles win its affection? 11. Not by incantations, certainly, but by conferring some benefit upon it. 1. Suppose you mean, Socrates, that if it were our intention to secure a good friend, we ought to make ourselves good both in word and deed. Did you think, asked Socrates, that it was possible for a bad man to acquire good friends? 1. Well, yes, replied Critobulus, because I have seen bad speakers on friendly terms with good orders, and incompetent commanders intimate with men of great military ability. Do you also know, Socrates asked, in the case that we are considering, any persons who can make useful friends although they are useless themselves? 1. No, certainly not, said he. But if it is impossible for a bad man to make truly good friends, there's a question that immediately arises: is it possible for a man who has shown himself truly good to be a friend, by that very fact, to those who are the same as himself? What is bothering you, Critobulus, is that you often see men who act honorably and shun anything discreditable, but instead of being friends, they quarrel and treat one another worse than if they were good for nothing. And it isn't only individuals that do this, said Critobulus. Even states that have the highest regard for honorable dealing and the least tolerance of anything base are often hostile in their attitude towards one another. These considerations make me very despondent about the acquisition of friends. On the one hand, I see that bad people can't be friends with one another. How can you make friends of those who are ungrateful or irresponsible or grasping or untrustworthy or undisciplined? It seems to me that bad men are altogether more naturally inclined to be enemies than friends to one another. Then again, as you say, it is equally impossible that bad men should be suitable for friendship with men of high character. For how can evildoers become friends of those who loathe that sort of conduct? And finally, if even those who practice goodness quarrel about preeminence in the state, are mutually envious and hate one another, who are there still left to be friends? And in what class of men shall we find trust and goodwill? 11. Well, Critobulus, said Socrates, this is rather a complex problem. By nature human beings have certain tendencies towards friendliness. They need one another, they feel pity, they benefit from cooperation, and, realizing this, they are grateful to one another. They also have hostile tendencies. When they have the same opinions about what things are beautiful and pleasant, they fight for their possession, and, falling out, take sides. Rivalry and passion also make for hostility. The desire to overreach is a cause of ill feeling, and envy arouses hatred. Nevertheless, friendliness finds a way through all these obstacles and unites men who are truly good. Their moral goodness makes them prefer to enjoy moderate possessions and avoid tribulation rather than gain absolute power by means of war, and enables them, when hungry and thirsty, to share their food and drink without a pang, and to control their pleasure in the sexual attraction of beauty in such a way as not to cause improper annoyance to anyone. It enables them not only to suppress greedy instincts and be content with a lawful share of wealth, but even to assist one another. It enables them to settle arguments not only without annoyance, but even to their mutual advantage, and to keep their tempers from rising to a degree that they will later regret. It rids them completely of envy, since they give their own goods into the possession of their friends, and regard their friends' property as their own. It must surely follow from this that in the sharing of political privileges too, truly good men not only do not hinder, but actually help one another. Those who desire political distinction and authority in order that they may have license to embezzle money, employ force against people and have a good time are likely to be unscrupulous, wicked and incapable of cooperation with others. But if a person wishes for political distinction to protect himself from injustice and to be able to give legitimate help to his friends, and, by holding office, wishes to try to do some good to his country, why shouldn't he be able to cooperate with others like himself? Will he, in company with truly good men, be less able to help his friends? Will he be more incapable of benefiting his country if he has the assistance of such men? Why, even in athletic contests it is obvious that if the strongest were allowed to band together against the weaker, they would win all the events and carry off all the prizes. In athletics, this is not allowed, but in public life, where truly good men have most influence, there is no objection to a man's combining with anyone he likes in order to benefit the state. So surely it is profitable for a man to prepare himself for public life by acquiring the best friends, and to use them as partners and helpers in his activities rather than as opponents. Then again, it is obvious that if you are at war with anyone, you will need allies, and you will need more of them if you are opposed by truly good men. Besides, you must benefit those who are prepared to be your allies, so that they may be willing to put their hearts into it. And it is far better to benefit the best, who are few, than the worst, who are many, because bad people demand much more in the way of services than good ones. Don't lose heart, Cretobulus, but try to make yourself a good man, and when you have succeeded, you can set about hunting for truly good people. Perhaps even I myself might be able to lend you a hand in the search on account of my experience in love. When I take a fancy to anyone, it's extraordinary how completely I throw myself into getting them to reciprocate my friendship, passion or craving for their society, as the case may be. I can see that you will feel the same need when you set your heart on making friends with people. Well, don't keep me in the dark about your aspirations. Thanks to my efforts to please those who please me, I think I'm not without experience in capturing people. As a matter of fact, Socrates, said Cretobulus, one have been anxious for this sort of instruction for a long time, especially if the same technique will help me find both character and physical beauty. Well, Cretobulus, said Socrates, my technique doesn't include prevailing upon good-looking people to stay by laying hands upon them. I am convinced that this is why men fled from Scylla, because she laid hands upon them. Whereas it is said of the sirens that because they never laid hands upon anyone, but always sang their enchanting songs from a distance, everyone stayed to hear their singing and was charmed by it. If you've got a good method of making friends, tell me what it is, said Cretobulus. One, promise I won't lay hands upon them. Then will you also refrain from laying your lips upon their lips? One asked Socrates. Don't worry, said Cretobulus, one won't even lay my lips upon anyone's lips unless he is good looking. There you go, Cretobulus, said Socrates. You have said just the opposite of what you ought. Beautiful people don't put up with that sort of thing, whereas ugly ones actually take pleasure in inviting it, and assume that they are called beautiful because of their characters. You can rest assured, said Cretobulus, that if I kiss the beautiful, I shall kiss the good even more. Now tell me the art of capturing friends. Well then, Cretobulus, said Socrates, when you want to become friendly with someone, will you let me inform him that you admire him and are eager to be his friend? Inform away, said Cretobulus. Nobody that I know of objects to being complimented, and if I further inform him, said Socrates, that, because of your admiration, you are kindly disposed towards him, you won't consider that I am misrepresenting you? One, no, he said. I myself feel a kindness towards anyone whom I imagine to be kindly disposed towards me. Very well, then, said Socrates, one shall be allowed to say this about you to any persons whom you wish to make your friends. If you will grant me further permission to say of you that you care about your friends, delight in nothing so much as in good friends, rejoice no less in your friends' good fortune than in your own, never weary in contriving that your friends may have good fortune, and believe that the best quality in a man is to outdo his friends in acts of kindness and his enemies in acts of hostility, then I think I should be a very efficient helper for you in winning good friends. Why do you talk to me like this, asked Cretobulus, as if it were not open to you to say whatever you like about it? Certainly is not, for the reason that I once heard Aspasia give. She said that good matchmakers were expert at joining people together in matrimony by giving true reports of their good qualities, but refused to sing their praises falsely, because the victims of such deception hated both each other and the woman who arranged the match. Well, I am convinced that she was right, and so I don't consider that I am entitled, in praising you, to say anything that is not true. 1c, Socrates, said Cretobulus. You are the sort of friend who will cooperate provided that I myself have some aptitude for the making of friends. Otherwise nothing would induce you to fabricate something to say to help me. Which do you think would be the better way of helping you, Cretobulus, asked Socrates, by praising you falsely or by persuading you to try to be a good person? If the answer isn't clear to you from this point of view, look at it from another. Suppose that I wanted to put you on friendly terms with the ship owner and praised you to him falsely by asserting that you were a good navigator, and suppose that he believed me and entrusted his ship to you, although you knew nothing about navigation. Are you optimistic enough to expect that you wouldn't destroy both yourself and the ship? Or suppose that by making a false public declaration, I prevailed upon the state to entrust itself to you, as to a man of military and legal and political ability, what do you think the consequences would be for yourself and the state? Or suppose that I were privately to persuade some of our citizens by false representations to give you charge of their property as an able and scrupulous administrator, when it came to the test, wouldn't you both ruin them and expose yourself to ridicule? No, Cretobulus, if you want to be thought good at anything, the shortest, safest and most reputable way is to try to make yourself really good at it. If you consider the virtues that are recognized among human beings, you will find that they are all increased by study and practice. that, Critobulus, is the way in which I think we ought to proceed. But if you incline to some other opinion, tell me what it is. No, Socrates, said Critobulus, one would be ashamed to oppose your point of view. If I did, what I said would be neither honorable nor true. When his friends had difficulties, if they were due to ignorance, he tried to remedy them by giving advice, and if to deficiency, by teaching them to help one another as much as they could. I will relate what I know about him in this connection. To one day he saw Aristarchus looking gloomy. You look as though you were weighed down by something, Aristarchus, he said. You ought to share the burden with your friends. Perhaps we can even relieve you a little, Aristarchus replied. Well, Socrates, I am indeed in serious difficulty. Since the civil war broke out, and large numbers withdrew to Piraeus, so many refugee sisters and nieces and female cousins have gathered together under my roof that there are 14 free persons in the house. We can get nothing from our farm, because it is in the hands of our opponents, and nothing from our house properties, because the town is practically deserted. There is no buyer for one's belongings, and one cannot even raise a loan from anywhere. I think you would sooner find money by looking for it in the streets than get it by borrowing. It is painful, Socrates, to stand by and watch one's family die by degrees. And it is impossible to feed so many in such difficult circumstances. When Socrates had heard this story, he said, Tell me, how is it that Ceremon, who has to feed a large household, not only is able to provide what is necessary for himself and them, but has so much to spare that he is actually rich, while you in feeding a large household are afraid that you will all die of want? One surely because he is feeding slaves, while I am feeding free people. Do you think that the free people in your house are better than the slaves in Ceremon's? L asked Socrates. In my opinion, he said, the free people in my house are the better. Isn't it a shame, then, said Socrates, that he should be well off because he has the worse household, while you who have a much better one are in need? That is doubtless because he is supporting artisans, while I am supporting people who've been raised free. Does artisans mean people who know how to make something useful? Certainly. Is pearled barley useful? Very. What about bread? No less so. What do you say about men's and women's coats, shirts, cloaks and tunics? They are all very useful too. Well then, said Socrates, don't your guests know how to make any of these things? One on the contrary, I'll imagine that they know how to make all of them. Then don't you know that from one of these trades, making barley into pearled barley, Nosicide supports not only himself and his servants, but also a large number of pigs and cattle, and has so much to spare that he often carries out public services for the state? One. And don't you know that from baking Cyribus both maintains his household in comfort and lives luxuriously, while Demes of Calidus too keeps himself by making cloaks, and Meno by making blankets, and most of the Megarians 3 by making tunics? Yes, he replied, because these people buy and keep foreign slaves so that they can compel them to do whatever work is convenient. But I am dealing with free people and relations. Do you really think, said Socrates, that because they are free and related to you, they ought to do nothing but eat and sleep? What is your view about other free people? Do you find that those who live in this way have a better time, and do you regard them as happier than those who concern themselves with things that they know are useful to life? Or do you observe that idleness and indifference help people to learn what they ought to know and remember what they have learned, to gain physical health and strength, and to acquire and keep what is useful to life, whereas energy and application are no help at all? Did these female relations of yours learn the arts which you say they understand because they regarded them as of no practical use and had no intention of practicing them? Wasn't it just the opposite? Didn't they mean to take them seriously and get some benefit from them? Which is the more sensible conduct for a human being, to do no work at all, or to occupy oneself usefully? And which has more integrity, to work, or to ponder about the necessaries of life without working? As things are, I suppose, there is no love lost between you. You feel that they are imposing upon you, they can see that you are annoyed with them. And consequently there is a danger that the ill feeling will grow and the former good will decline. But if you encourage them to work, you will feel friendly towards them, when you see that they are doing something for you, and they will like you when they realize that you are pleased with them. And as you both remember former acts of kindness with greater pleasure, you will increase the gratitude aroused by these acts, with the result that the relations between you will become cordial and intimate. Now, if these women were faced with an occupation that was dishonorable, they might fairly choose to die first. But as it is, the kinds of work at which they are competent are apparently those which are considered to be most honorable and appropriate for a woman. And everybody does most easily, quickly, pleasurably and well what he understands. So don't hesitate, he concluded, to suggest to them a course of action that will benefit both you and them. They will probably be glad to comply. Upon my word, said Aristarchus, your advice strikes me as being really good, Socrates. Up until now, I haven't been anxious to borrow, because I knew that, when I had spent what I had, I shouldn't be able to pay it back. But now I feel I can bring myself to do it so as to meet the initial outlay for the work. The result of this conversation was that capital was obtained and wool purchased. The women began to work before breakfast, and went on until supper time. And they were cheerful instead of gloomy. Instead of eyeing each other askance, the two parties regarded each other with pleasure. The women felt for Aristarchus the affection due to a guardian, and he grew fond of them for their practical help. In the end he went to Socrates and joyfully told him the whole story, adding that he himself was now criticized as being the only person in the house who did not work for his keep. You should tell them the story about the dog, said Socrates. They say that in the days when animals could talk, a sheep said to its master, I don't understand your conduct. To us, who provide you with wool and lambs and cheese, you give nothing except what we get from the earth. But to the dog, who provides you with nothing of this kind, you give a share of your own food." The dog heard this and said, "Quite right too, I am the one to whom you owe security from being stolen by men and carried off by wolves. If I didn't watch over you, you wouldn't even be able to graze for fear of being killed." In the light of this argument, the story goes, even the sheep conceded the dog his privileges. So you should tell your womenfolk that you take the place of the dog in guarding them and taking care of them. And that it is through you that they are unmolested and can live and work safely and happily. Seeing another old friend one day after a long time, Socrates said, "Where did you spring from, Eutherus?" "I at the end of the war, Socrates," he replied. "One came back from abroad, but now I live nearby. Since we lost our foreign property and my father left me no property in Attica, I have been forced to take up residence here and to earn a living by manual labor. It seems better to do this than to appeal to someone for help, especially as I have no security on which to borrow." "And how long do you suppose your constitution is capable of supporting you by working for hire?" One asked Socrates. "Not very long, certainly. Besides," said Socrates, "as you get older, obviously your expenses will increase, and no one will be willing to pay you for your manual labor." "That's true," he said. "Then you had better apply yourself at once to the sort of occupation that will still be suitable for you when you are older. You should approach some owner of a large estate who needs assistance in managing it, so that, by superintending the work, helping to get in the produce and taking care of the property, you may both confer benefit on him and receive it in return. One should find it hard to give up my freedom, Socrates," he said. "But in the political sphere the fact that a man holds an official position and manages public affairs makes him regarded not as more servile, but as more free. As a general principle, Socrates," he said, "I don't at all like being responsible to anybody." "But, Eutherus," said Socrates, "it is not at all easy to find an occupation in which one cannot be called to account. It is difficult to do anything faultlessly, and it is difficult, even with a faultless performance, not to incur ill-judged criticism. Indeed, even in respect of the work that you say you are now doing, I wonder if you find it easy to get through it without incurring blame. So you must try to avoid censorious people and seek the company of good-natured ones. If a job is within your power, you must put up with it. If it is not, you must avoid it. And whatever you do, you must give it your best and keenest attention. If you take this advice, I think that you will incur the least risk of blame, you will have the best prospect of finding a remedy for your difficulties, and you will live with the least trouble and anxiety, and with the amplest provision for your old age." I know that he also once heard Crito complain what a difficult thing life in Athens was for a man who wanted to mind his own business. "At this very moment," he said, "some people are bringing an action against me, not because they have any grievance against me, but because they believe that I would rather pay than have trouble." Socrates said, "Tell me, Crito, do you keep dogs to protect your sheep from wolves?" "One indeed I do," he replied. "It is more profitable for me to keep them than not to." "Then mightn't you also keep a man who is willing and able to protect you from anyone who tried to do you wrong?" "One should be glad to," he said, "if I weren't afraid that he might turn on me." "Well," said Socrates, "can't you see that it is much more pleasant to benefit by the goodwill of a man like yourself than by incurring his enmity? You may be sure that there are people in this city who would greatly aspire to enjoy your friendship." As a result of this conversation, they discovered Archidamus, a person of considerable rhetorical and practical ability, but poor, because he was not the sort to make money indiscriminately. He was a man of strict principles, and he said it was very easy to get money from these sycophants. So whenever Crito was getting in crops of corn, olives, wine, wool or any other useful agricultural produce, he used to set some aside and give it to Archidamus. And, whenever he gave a dinner, he invited him. And he showed him every consideration of this kind. Archidamus regarded Crito's house as a haven of refuge, and treated him with great respect. He very soon found out that the sycophants threatening Crito were far from innocent and had enemies, and he summoned one of them to face a public trial at which it was to be decided what punishment or penalty he must suffer. Since the sycophant was conscious of a good many misdeeds, he did everything he could to rid himself of Archidamus. But Archidamus refused to be shaken off until the man abandoned his attack on Crito and gave Archidamus a sum of money. When Archidamus had carried out this and other similar operations, many of Crito's friends begged him to extend the protection of Archidamus to themselves as well, just as when a shepherd has a good sheepdog the other shepherds want to station their flocks near him, so that they too might benefit from the dog. Archidamus was pleased to gratify Crito, and not only Crito but his friends too were left in peace. If any of Archidamus' enemies taunted him with toadying to Crito in return for benefits received, he said, "There are two alternatives. You can either cultivate the friendship of honest men by returning their kindness, which will make bad men your enemies. Or you can make truly good men your enemies by trying to do them wrong, and, by collaborating with bad men, try to make them your friends and try to get along with them rather than good men. Which of those two alternatives is the more discreditable?" From this time on Archidamus was one of Crito's friends and was highly esteemed by the rest of Crito's friends. 10. I know that Socrates had the following conversation with one of his companions. "Diodorus, tell me, Diodorus," he said, "if one of your house slaves runs away, do you see to it that you get him safely back again?" "One, yes, indeed," he said, "and I'll invite the help of others by offering a reward for his recovery." "Well," Socrates went on, "if one of your house slaves is ill, do you look after him and call in doctors to guard against his dying?" "One certainly do, and if One of your acquaintances who is much more useful to you than your house slaves is in danger of dying of want. Don't you think that you should see to it that he is saved? You must surely know that Hermogenes is not insensitive, and that he would feel ashamed if he didn't return your kindness. Also, to have an assistant who is willing, loyal, reliable and able to carry out instructions, and not only that, but capable of independent action, foresight and planning, this is surely worth a good many house slaves. Now, good estate managers say that when you can purchase something valuable at a low price, you ought to buy it. And at the present time, owing to circumstances, it is possible to acquire good friends very reasonably. Diodorus said, "You are quite right, Socrates. Tell Hermogenes to come and see me." "Certainly not." One said Socrates. "To my mind it's no more proper for you to summon him than it is to go to him yourself. And it's no more to his advantage to have the business completed than it is to yours." So Diodorus went to see Hermogenes, and with a small outlay he acquired a friend who made it his business to look out for every opportunity to help Diodorus and make him happy. Book 3. I shall now describe how Socrates used to help people with honorable ambitions by making them apply themselves to the objects of those ambitions. One day he heard that Dionysius had come to Athens and was offering to teach the art of military command. So he said to one of his companions, who he knew was eager to attain the position of general in the state, "You know, my boy, it's a poor thing for one who wants to be a general in the state to neglect the opportunity of instruction when it's available. Such a person would be more justly liable to prosecution than one who undertook to make statues without having learned how to sculpt. For in the perils of war the whole state is entrusted to the care of the general, and the good effects of his success and the bad effects of his failures are likely to be equally far-reaching. So a man who did his best to get himself elected to this position without troubling to learn how to discharge it would surely deserve to be penalized." By using arguments like these, Socrates persuaded him to go and take lessons. When he came back after completing the course, Socrates began to tease him. "You know, gentlemen," he said, "how Homer describes Agamemnon as majestic. 3. Don't you think that our friend here seems more majestic now that he has learned how to be a general? A man who has learned to play a musical instrument is a musician even if he is not playing it. And someone who has learned to cure disease is a doctor even if he is not practicing. In the same way, from now on our friend will always be a general, even if nobody appoints him. But the untrained person is neither a general nor a doctor, even if his appointment is unanimous. However," he went on, "in case one of us serves under you as a senior or junior officer, we ought to have a better grasp of military studies. So tell us where he began to teach you the art of military command." At the same point he stopped and said the young man, "He taught me tactics and nothing else." "But that is only a fraction of the general's business," said Socrates. "A general must be able to get together the resources for making war and provide supplies for his men. He must be inventive, active and attentive, persevering and brilliant, both friendly and harsh, both straightforward and subtle, a good protector and a good thief, lavish and rapacious, generous and grasping, steady and aggressive. And a man must have a great many other qualities, natural and acquired, if he is to be a good general. Still, it is a fine thing to be a tactician. An orderly army is far superior to a disorderly one, just as the materials of a house, bricks and stones, timber and tiles, are no good at all when dumped at random, but when they are arranged as they are combined in a building, with the material which will neither rot nor disintegrate, the stones and tiles, underneath and on top, and with the bricks and timber in between, then the result is a valuable possession, house. That's a close parallel, Socrates, said the young man, because in war too you should post the best troops in front and in the rear, and the worst in between, so that they may be led on by the one lot and pushed forward by the other. That's all right, said Socrates, if the lecturer has taught you how to distinguish the good from the bad. But if he hasn't, what have you gained from your lessons? I mean, if he told you to arrange the finest coinage in front and at the back, and the worst in between, without explaining to you how to tell good money from counterfeit, that would be no use to you either. He certainly didn't teach us that, so we shall have to distinguish good and bad for ourselves. Then why not consider how we can avoid making blunders about them? One asked Socrates. One should like to, said the young man. Well then, said Socrates, supposing that we had to carry off some silver, wouldn't it be sound tactics to give the first place to those who were fondest of silver? 1. Yes, I think so. What about facing danger? Should we put the most ardent lovers of glory in the front rank? They are certainly the people who are willing to take risks in order to earn praise. Of course, they aren't hard to identify. They are conspicuous everywhere, and would be easy to pick out. Tell me, said Socrates, did he only teach you how to arrange your troops, or did he also explain how and in what circumstances you should employ each formation? 1. No, not at all, said he, but there are many situations which call for quite different arrangements and movements of troops. He certainly didn't distinguish them clearly. Then surely you ought to go back and ask him more questions, said Socrates. If he knows his subject and has a conscience, he will be ashamed to send you away with gaps in your knowledge after taking your money. One day Socrates met a man who had just been appointed general, and he asked him, why do you think Homer called Agamemnon shepherd of the plough? 1. Was it because it is the shepherd's duty to see to it that his sheep are safe and have their food, and that the purpose for which they are kept is achieved? And in the same way it is the general's duty to see that his soldiers are safe and have their food, and that the purpose for which they are serving is achieved, this purpose being to improve their fortune by defeating the enemy? Or what did he mean by praising Agamemnon as both a good king and a stout? Was it that he would be a stout warrior not if he alone contended bravely with the enemy, but if he caused the whole army to do so, and a good king not if He merely directed his own life well, but if he also brought happiness to his subjects? For a king is chosen not to take good care of his own interests, but to secure the well-being of those who chose him. And all peoples go to war with one object only, to secure the best possible living conditions for themselves, and they appoint generals for the single purpose of leading them to this goal. So it is the duty of a general to realize the aims of those who appointed him as such. And, in fact, it is not easy to find a nobler purpose than this, or a baser one than its opposite. By investigating in this way what is the ideal of a good leader, he eliminated all other considerations and left securing the happiness of his followers. I know that he also once had the following conversation with someone who had been appointed to a cavalry command. 3 Could you tell us, young man, he said, why you set your heart on becoming a cavalry officer? I presume that it wasn't that you wanted to ride at the head of the cavalry, because that is the privilege of the mounted archers at least. They ride ahead of even the cavalry commander. That's true, he said, and it wasn't publicity that you wanted either. For even lunatics are recognized by everybody. That's true too. Well then, is it because you think that you might hand back cavalry which you have improved to the state, and that if any need for mounted troops should arise you might do our country some service as their commander? One yes, precisely, he said. A very fine thing too, said Socrates, if you can do this. The command for which you have been chosen is, I suppose, over both horses and riders. Yes, it is. Come along, then, first tell us how you propose to improve the horses. But I don't think that is my job, he said. Each man ought to look after his own horse. Well, said Socrates, suppose that you find some of them turning out their horses with such bad feet or legs, or in such poor condition, or so underfed, that they can't keep up with the rest, and you find others coming up with horses which are so fresh that they won't keep their places or are such kickers that you can't get them into position at all. What will be the good of your cavalry? How will you be able to do your country any service if your troopers are mounted like that? One, you're right, he said. One will do my best to look after the horses. Well, now, what about the horsemen? Won't you try to improve their quality? One, yes, I will. Won't you begin by making them better at mounting their horses? One ought to, certainly, because then if one of them fell off, his chances of survival would be improved. And next, if you have to risk an engagement, will you order them to draw the enemy onto the sandy ground where you are accustomed to exercise, or will you try to carry out your training in the sort of country in which campaigns are fought? One, that would be better, certainly. Next, will you make it a concern of yours that as many of your men as possible can hurl weapons from horseback? That would be a good idea too. Is it your intention to make your troopers braver warriors by whetting their courage and rousing their anger against the enemy? One, if it wasn't, I will try to make it so now, he said. Have you given any thought to the question of obedience? For without it there is no use in horses or horsemen, however good and warlike. True, he said. But how can one best direct them towards it, Socrates? One, you know, I'm sure, that in every situation people are readiest to obey those whom they consider to be best. In illness they pay most attention to the man who they think has most medical knowledge. And on board ship the passengers pay most attention to the man they regard as the most experienced sailor. And in farming most attention is paid to the man who is regarded as the most experienced farmer. Quite so, then presumably in the case of horsemanship too, the man who clearly knows best what ought to be done is most likely to receive the willing obedience of the rest. Then if I am obviously better than any of them, Socrates, will that be enough to make them obey me? One, yes, provided that you also let them know that obedience to you will be both more honorable and more salutary for them than disobedience. How shall I teach them that? Much more easily, I'll assure you, than if you had to teach them that bad conduct is better and more profitable than good conduct. Do you mean, said he, that besides all his other duties a cavalry officer ought to cultivate the ability to speak well? Did you suppose that he had to exercise his command in silence? Haven't you noticed that all the ideals that tradition has taught us, ideals to which we owe our knowledge of how to live, learn through discourse, and that any other fine accomplishment anyone acquires is acquired by means of discourse? That the best teachers make the most use of discourse, and those who have the profoundest knowledge of the most important subjects are the most brilliant debaters? Now, here's another point. Haven't you noticed that when a chorus is chosen to represent this city of ours, like the one which is sent to Delos, no chorus from anywhere else can match it, and no other city can muster a display of manhood like ours? One, that's true, he said. But it's not so much in quality of voice, or in physical size and strength that Athenians are superior to the rest, as in the love of honor, which is the keenest incentive to noble and honorable actions. That's true too, he said. Then don't you think that if someone made our cavalry his concern, the Athenians would be far superior here too, both in their provision of equipment and horses, and by their discipline and readiness to venture against the enemy, if they thought that by doing so they would win praise and honor? Aye, very likely. Then don't hesitate any longer, said Socrates, but try to induce your men to adopt a course which will benefit both you and, through you, the rest of our people as well. All right, he said, one will certainly try. One day he saw Nicomachides coming away from the elections, and asked, who have been elected as generals, Nicomachides? I. Why, naturally, Socrates, he replied, the people of Athens, being what they are, have not elected me, although I am worn out with active service as an officer, and have received all these wounds from the enemy. As he spoke, he drew back his clothes and exhibited the scars. But they have chosen Antisthenes, one who has never served in the infantry and has won no distinction in the cavalry, and knows nothing except how to pile up money. Surely it's a good thing, said Socrates, if he will be able to provide his men with supplies? One merchants can pile up money to said Nicomachides, but that doesn't qualify them to be generals. But Antisthenes is set on winning, replied Socrates, which is an appropriate quality for a general. Haven't you noticed that every time he has had to finance a chorus he has always won? Won? Yes, said Nicomachides, but it's one thing to have charge of a chorus, and quite another to have charge of an army. All the same, said Socrates. Although Antisthenes had no experience of singing or of training a chorus, he succeeded in finding the best people for his purpose, so in his capacity as general, said Nicomachides, he will find other people to work out his tactics and to do the fighting. Well, said Socrates, if he is as good at searching out and selecting the best agents in his military operations as he is in training his courses, he will probably be successful in this case too. Besides, he would naturally be prepared to spend more to win a military victory with the whole nation than to win a choral competition with his tribe. 13. Do you mean, Socrates, that a good chorus trainer would also make a good general? One mean that, when a man is given a post of responsibility, if he knows what is needed and is able to supply it, he can fill that post efficiently, whether it relates to a chorus or an estate or a country or an army, one must say, Socrates said. Nicomachides, one never thought that I should hear you say that good estate managers would make good generals. Come along. Then he said, let's consider their respective duties, so that we may see whether they are the same or there is some difference. By all means, isn't it the duty of both of them to make their subordinates obedient and tractable? I certainly. What about assigning the various tasks to those who are qualified to perform them? 1 to 2, then I suppose it is appropriate for both to punish the bad and give credit to the good. Quite so, and surely it is proper for both to make their subordinates loyal to them? 1 to 2, do you think that it is in the interest of both to win allies and helpers, or not? 1 It certainly is. Shouldn't both be conservative of their possessions? 1 Very much so. Then shouldn't they both be careful and industrious in all their duties? 1 All these qualities are equally applicable to both. But fighting is not. But surely both make enemies? 11 That is so, certainly. Isn't it in the interest of both to get the better of quite? But you're leaving something out of account. If fighting becomes necessary, what will be the good of estate management? I surely then it will be more valuable than ever the good estate manager, knowing that nothing brings so much profit and gain as defeating one's enemies in battle, and nothing so much loss and ruin as being defeated, will eagerly seek and prepare what is conducive to victory, and will carefully note and guard against what tends towards defeat. And if he sees that his preparations offer hope of victory, he will vigorously fight. And not least in importance, if he is unprepared, he will avoid an engagement. You mustn't despise estate managers, Nicomachides. The difference between the care of private and the care of public affairs is only one of degree. In all other respects they are closely similar, especially in that neither can dispense with human agency, and the human agents are the same in both cases. Those who look after public affairs employ just the same agents as in managing their private properties. And if people understand how to use these agents, they carry out their duties successfully, whether public or private. But if they do not, then they come to grief in either case. One day Socrates was talking to Pericles, the son of the famous Pericles you know. Pericles, he said, one have high hopes that if you are appointed as a general, our city will become more efficient and renowned in warfare, and will conquer its enemies. Pericles replied, one should like it to be as you say, Socrates, but I've no idea how it could happen. Would you like to discuss the subject, then, said Socrates, and try to discover how it could come about? One Yes, please, he said. Very well. Then, you know that the Athenians are not inferior in numbers to the Boeotians? 1 Yes, I know that. Do you think that there would be more examples of physical perfection in Boeotia than in Athens? I, to my mind, we aren't inferior in this respect either, and which people do you suppose is more loyal? One should say the Athenians. A good many of the Boeotians resent the aggressiveness of the Thebans, but I don't see anything of that sort at Athens. Besides, the Athenians have a greater thirst for glory and pride than any other people. And these are no slight incentives to taking risks for the sake of honor and country. In this respect too the Athenians are above criticism. Then again, no people can claim more or greater ancestral exploits than the Athenians. And consequently many of them are inspired by these examples to cultivate virtue and show themselves brave fighters. All this is true, Socrates. But you can see that ever since the disasters suffered by Ptolemaides in the Thousand at Albadia, and by Hippocrates at Delium, the prestige of Athens has been low in relation to Boeotia, and the confidence of Thebes high in relation to Athens. The result is that the Boeotians, who used not even to dare, in their own territory, to face the Athenians without the support of the Spartans and the other Peloponnesians, are now threatening to invade Attica by themselves. And the Athenians, who used to wreak havoc in Boeotia, are afraid that the Boeotians will ravage Attica. One realized that this is so, said Socrates, but it seems to me that our city is now more amenably disposed towards a good leader. Confidence induces carelessness, indifference and disobedience, but fear makes people more inclined to be attentive, obedient and disciplined. You can see an illustration of this in what happens on board ships. When there's nothing to fear, the crew are completely unruly. But so long as they are afraid of storm or enemy, they not only carry out all instructions, but wait for the next order in perfect silence like members of a chorus. Well, said Pericles, assuming that now they are at their most obedient, it would be the right moment to say how we can encourage them to set their hearts again upon their former virtue, renown and happiness. If we wanted them to claim property that was in the possession of others, said Socrates, the best way of inciting them to lay hands upon that property would be by proving to them that it belonged to them by inheritance. and since we want them to make it their object to excel in virtue, we must similarly show them that this has been their special characteristic from of old, and that if they cultivated it seriously, they could be the most powerful nation in the world. How can we teach them this lesson? 1. Suppose by reminding them of the stories they have been told about how excellent their earliest recorded ancestors were. Do you mean the contest of the gods which Cecrops and his advisors were allowed to decide because of their goodness? 11. Yes, and the birth and upbringing of Erechtheus, and the war that broke out in his time against the inhabitants of all the adjoining mainland. 3. And the war against the Peloponnesians in the days of the sons of Heracles, and all the campaigns under Theseus, in all of which our ancestors showed themselves plainly to be the best men of their time. Or again there are the feats accomplished later by their descendants not much before our time, those in which they strived unaided against an enemy who was master of the whole of Asia and of Europe as far as Macedonia, and who possessed vaster armies and resources and had carried out greater operations than any previous nation. And those in which they shared the leadership by land and sea with the Peloponnesians. These Athenians too are reputed to have far surpassed the other people of their time. So it is said, and that is why, in spite of the many migrations that have taken place in Greece, they remained in their own country, and often answered appeals for arbitration from those disputing about their rights, and often gave sanctuary to the victims of oppression one can't understand. Socrates said. Pericles, how it was that our country ever deteriorated? Socrates replied, you know how athletes sometimes, when they have enjoyed unchallenged superiority, through sheer lack of enterprise become no match for their opponents. My belief is that in the same way the people of Athens were so far supreme that they became negligent, and that their deterioration is due to this. Well then, he said, what can they do now to recover their former excellence? 1. Socrates replied, don't think that the answer is anything abstruse. If they rediscovered their ancestors' way of life and followed it as well as they did, they would prove to be just as good men as they were. Alternatively, if they took as their model the present leaders of the Greek world and followed their way of life, then, with equal application to the same activities, they would become no worse than their models, and with greater application they would actually surpass them. You imply, said Pericles, that our country is a long way from true goodness. Are the Athenians ever likely to equal the Spartans in showing respect for their elders, when they despise anyone older than themselves, beginning with their fathers, or in developing their bodies, when they not only care nothing for physical fitness themselves but jeer at those who do care about it? Will they ever have as much obedience to authority, when they pride themselves on despising authority? Will they ever have as much unanimity, when, so far from working together for their common interest, they are more envious and abusive towards one another than towards the rest of the world, quarrel more in their meetings, both private and public, than any other people, and bring the greatest number of actions against one another? When they prefer to gain in this way at one another's expense rather than by cooperation, and, while treating public duties as no personal concern of theirs, at the same time fight over them, taking the greatest delight in the qualities that fit them for such quarreling. As a result of this, a great deal of harm and mischief is developing in our city, and a great deal of mutual enmity and hatred is growing in the hearts of our people. And for this reason I, for my part, am in constant dread that some intolerable disaster will fall upon our city. Really, Pericles, said Socrates, you mustn't imagine that the Athenians are suffering from such incurable depravity as that. Don't you see how well disciplined they are in the navy, and how punctiliously they obey the officials at athletic meetings, and how, when they are members of a chorus, they follow the directions of their trainers as thoroughly as anyone? 1. Yes, that's the strange thing, you know, that people like these should obey their superiors, while the infantry and cavalry, who are supposed to be the pick of the population in general excellence, should be the most unruly. Socrates said, but what about the council of the Areopagus, Pericles? 1. Isn't it composed of men of tried character? 1. Yes, indeed. Do you know any other body that tries cases and conducts all its other business better, or more in accordance with law, honor and justice? 1. Have nothing to say against them. Then you mustn't despair of the Athenians as being disorderly, but on military service, where there is the greatest need for self-control, discipline and obedience, they give no thought to any of these qualities. Perhaps, said Socrates, that is because in this sphere they have the least expert direction. Don't you see that in the case of musicians and singers and dancers, nobody without expert knowledge attempts to give directions, and similarly with wrestlers and pancratiasts? The authorities on all these subjects can point to the source from which they learn the arts for which they are responsible. But the great majority of military commanders are self-taught. However, I don't imagine that you are that sort of person. I'll expect that you can tell me when you began to learn generalship just as easily as when you began to learn wrestling. I'll expect that besides keeping a stock of stratagems which you have inherited from your father, you have amassed a great many from every source from which you could learn anything useful for the art of war, and I'll expect that you are constantly on your guard against inadvertent ignorance of anything that is useful to this end. And that, if you become aware that there is something of this sort which you don't know, you seek out the experts in the subject, grudging neither presents nor favors, in order to learn from them what you don't know and have the help of qualified persons. Pericles replied, you can't deceive me, Socrates. Your reason for saying all this is certainly not that you think that I do take these things seriously. You are trying to show me that one ought to take them seriously, if one aspires to be a general. As a matter of fact, I quite agree with you. Have you noted the fact, Pericles, that our frontier is protected by high mountains running down into Boeotia, through which the approaches into our territory are narrow and steep, and that there is a belt of rugged mountains through the middle of Attica? Yes, of course. Well now, have you heard that the Mysians and Pisidians, who occupy extremely rugged country in the territories of the king of Persia, are able, though only lightly armed, not only to preserve their independence, but to do the Persians a good deal of damage by raiding their territory? One. Yes, I have heard that too. Don't you think that, if the young and active members of the Athenian army were equipped with lighter arms and occupied the mountains that screen our frontiers, they would be able to harass our enemies and form an effective defense for our people against invasion? One think that all these are useful suggestions, said Pericles. Well then, said Socrates, if you approve of them, give them a trial, my good friend. If you can put any of them into practice, it will be to your credit and the benefit of your country. And if in some respects you can't, you will neither harm your country nor bring discredit upon yourself. When Glaucon the son of Ariston was trying to become a popular orator, because he was set on being the head of the state although he was not yet 20 years old, none of his friends and intimates could stop him. He was always getting dragged off the public platform and laughed at. The one person who prevailed upon him was Socrates, who was kindly disposed towards him for the sake of two people, Charmides the son of Glaucon, and Plato. Socrates happened to meet him and first won his attention by addressing him in the following way. Glaucon, he said, have you made up your mind to become the head of our state? One have. Socrates, he replied, yes, that is, without a doubt, a fine thing. I don't know that there is any higher human ambition. Clearly, if you succeed in it, you will have the power to obtain whatever you desire, and be able to help your friends. You will gain distinction for your family and extend the power of your country. And you will win a name for yourself, first in our city, and then in Greece, and perhaps even, like Themistocles, among foreign powers. Wherever you are, every eye will be fixed upon you. This description appealed to Glaucon's vanity, and he was glad to linger. Socrates then went on, now, it's obvious, isn't it, Glaucon, that if you want to be held in honor, you must help your country? One. Certainly. Well then, he said, please don't make a secret of it, but tell us where you will start to benefit your country. Glaucon made no reply, as if he were considering for the first time where he should start. Surely, asked Socrates, if you wanted to make the family of a friend more important, you would try to make it wealthier. On the same principle, I suppose you will try to make your country wealthier, won't you? One. Yes, of course. Wouldn't it be wealthier if its revenues were increased? Naturally. Tell me, then, what are our country's present revenues derived from, and what do they amount to? No doubt you have looked into this, so that you may make up any of them that are inadequate and supply any that are lacking. Actually, Glaucon admitted, one haven't looked into that. Well, said Socrates, if you have left that aside, tell us what the country's expenditure is. You must be planning to curtail any extravagance. Actually, said Glaucon, one haven't had time for that yet either. Then we will defer the question of making the country wealthier. It is impossible for someone who doesn't know what the expenditure and revenues are to look after them, but, Socrates, said Glaucon, it is possible to enrich one's country from the resources of its enemies. Yes, indeed, perfectly possible, said Socrates, if you are stronger than they are. If you are weaker, you are likely to lose even what you have already. That is true. So before someone starts considering on whom to make war, he ought to know the strength both of his own country and of her opponents, so that, if his country is stronger, he may encourage her to undertake the war, and, if she is weaker, he may persuade her to be cautious. Quite right. Then tell us first what our country's land and sea forces are, and then do the same for the enemies. Well, he said, one can't, of course, tell you offhand. If you've got the details written down, fetch them. I should very much like to hear the answer. Actually, I haven't got them written down either. Very well, then, said Socrates, we will put off our military discussion too for the time being. Probably, besides your being so newly in office, you haven't yet had time to go carefully into the matter because of its magnitude. But of course I'm sure that you have already given your attention to the defense of our territory, and know how many guard posts are well placed and how many are not, and how many of the garrisons are adequate and how many are not. And you will recommend the strengthening of those that are well placed and the abolition of those that are superfluous. Actually, I shall recommend abolishing the lots, said Glaucon, because the result of their defense is that our crops get stolen. But if the guard posts are abolished, said Socrates, don't you think that it will be open to anyone to help himself really? By the way, have you found this out by personal inspection, or how do you know that the posts are badly manned? One. Assume it, he said. Shall we wait to discuss this subject too until we have got beyond assumptions and know the facts? One. Perhaps that would be better, said Glaucon. Then there are the silver mines, said Socrates. One. Know that you haven't visited them so that you can account for the decline of revenue from them. No, I haven't. As a matter of fact, said Socrates, they say that it's an unhealthy district. So when you have to state your views about it, this excuse will cover you. You're making fun of me, said Glaucon, but there's another problem that I'm sure you haven't neglected. No doubt you've investigated how long the country can be fed on home-produced corn, and how much extra is needed each year. You wouldn't like your country to incur a shortage of this kind without your realizing it. You would wish to be able to advise from personal knowledge about essential supplies, and so give her help and security. That's an enormous task you're suggesting, said Glaucon, if one is to be obliged to look after that sort of thing. But surely, said Socrates, a man could never manage even his own household properly unless he knew all its deficiencies and saw to it that they were all supplied, as our city consists of more than 10,000 houses, and it is difficult to look after so many households simultaneously. Why don't you first try to look after 1. Your uncles, It needs it. And if you can cope with that, you can try your hand at more. But if you can't do any good to one, how can you do good to many? If a man can't carry one talent in weight, surely it's obvious that he shouldn't even try to carry more than one. Well, said Glaucon, one might do something for my uncle's household, if he would follow my advice. So although you can't persuade your uncle, said Socrates, you expect to be able to make the whole population of Athens, including your uncle, follow your advice? Take care, my dear Glaucon, that your craving for distinction doesn't take you in the opposite direction. Can't you see how risky it is to say or to do things that one doesn't know about? Among the rest of your acquaintances, consider those whom you know to be the sort of people who obviously say and do things that they don't know about. Do you think that they are more admired or despised for this sort of conduct? And then consider the case of those who know what they are saying and what they are doing. In my opinion, you will find in every sphere of action that esteem and admiration are reserved for those who are best informed, while ignominy and contempt are the lot of the most ignorant. So if you want to be esteemed and admired in the state, try to ensure as far as possible that you know about the things that you want to do. If you have this advantage over the rest when you try your hand at politics, I shouldn't be surprised if you realized your ambition quite easily. When he saw that Charmides, the son of Glaucon, though a person of influence and much more capable than the active politicians of that time, was hesitant to enter public life and handle his country's affairs, he said, "Tell me, Charmides, supposing that there was somebody capable of winning at the major athletic competitions so as to gain honor for himself and enhance his country's reputation in Greece, and supposing that he refused to compete, what sort of man would you think he was? One obviously soft and unenterprising, and supposing that there was somebody who, though capable of handling his country's affairs in such a way as to raise its prestige and win honor himself, was hesitant to do so, wouldn't he reasonably be regarded as unenterprising? I probably. But why do you ask me that? Because I think you are failing to use your administrative ability, and that in a sphere where you are bound as a citizen to take part. What's your evidence for this accusation? One asked Charmides. In what kind of activity have you studied my ability? In your relations with politicians. When they consult you, I notice that you give them good advice, and when they make mistakes, your criticism is fair and right. It's not the same thing, Socrates, he protested, to talk to a person privately and to debate in public. All the same, said Socrates, a man who can count counts just as well in public as by himself, and the best private performers of music are also those who are most successful in public. But don't you realize that humility and fear are part of human nature, and that they come out much more in public than in private gatherings? One yes, and I am anxious to show you something. You are neither overawed by the cleverest people nor afraid of the most powerful, and yet you are too modest to speak in front of the silliest and weakest. Whom are you shy of? The fullers or the shoemakers or the carpenters or the smiths or the farmers or the merchants or the dealers in the agora, whose business it is to buy at a cheaper rate and sell at a dearer one? For all these people go to make up the assembly. What difference do you think there is between what you are doing and someone who can be trained athletes and is afraid of amateurs? You converse easily with our leading statesmen, some of whom look down on you, and you are far better qualified than the professional politicians. Yet you shrink from speaking in front of people who have never troubled their heads about politics or formed a poor opinion of you, because you are afraid of being laughed at. Well, don't you think, said Charmides, that the members of the assembly often laugh at those who advocate the right policy? Yes, and so do the others. That's why I am surprised that although you can easily deal with the one class when they behave that way, you imagine that you will be quite incapable of facing the other. My good man, don't be ignorant of yourself, or make the usual mistake. Most people, when they are set upon looking into other people's affairs, never turn to examine themselves. Don't shirk this responsibility, but make a greater effort to take yourself seriously. And don't neglect public affairs if you can improve them in any way, because, if they are well conducted, it will benefit not only the rest of the citizen body, but your personal friends, and not least yourself. Aristippus was once trying to argue Socrates down in the same way as he had been argued down by him in the past. Socrates, whose object was to benefit the people listening, answered not like a man who is guarding against getting his argument tangled up, but like one who is fully convinced that he is doing his duty. Aristippus asked him whether he knew anything that was good. His intention was, if Socrates mentioned anything such as food or drink or money or health or strength or courage, to prove that it was sometimes. But Socrates knew that if anything annoys us, what we need is something to stop it, and he replied in the most effective way. Are you asking if I know something good for fever? One, of course not. For ophthalmia? I know, not that either. For starvation? One, no, nor starvation either. Well, if you are asking me whether I know anything that is good for nothing, I don't, and what's more I don't want to. Another time, Aristippus asked him whether he knew anything fine. Yes indeed, plenty of things. Well then, are they all alike? On the contrary, some are as unlike as they can be. How can a thing be fine if it is unlike what is fine? 1. Why, because a man who is a fine runner has another unlike him who is a fine wrestler. And a shield which is fine for defense is totally unlike a spear which is fine for throwing hard and fast. You are giving me just the same sort of answer as when L asked you if you knew anything good. Do you really imagine that goodness and fineness are different? Don't you know that things are always good and fine by the same standards? In the first place, virtue is not good for some things and fine for others. Secondly, people are called fine and good on the same grounds and with the same ends in view. and people's bodies are obviously fine and good in relation to the same end. And everything else that we use is considered to be fine and good in accordance with the same standard, namely, the end for which it is serviceable. Then is a dung basket fine? One certainly, and a golden shield is contemptible, if the one is finely and the other badly constructed for carrying out its function. Do you mean that the same things are both fine and contemptible? I certainly, and, what's more, both good and bad. Often what is good for starvation is bad for fever, and vice versa. And what is fine for running is contemptible for wrestling, and vice versa. Everything is good and fine insofar as it's well adapted for its purpose, and bad and contemptible insofar as it's ill adapted. Similarly, in maintaining that a fine house is one that serves its purpose well, Socrates seemed to me to be teaching the principle that buildings should satisfy practical requirements. He approached the question in this sort of way: if a man is to have the sort of house that he needs, ought he to contrive to make it as pleasant and convenient as possible to live in? When this was admitted, isn't it pleasant to have a house which is cool in summer and warm in winter? When they agreed to this too, well, in houses that have a south aspect, in winter the sun shines into the verandas, while in summer it passes over our heads and over the roof and casts a shade. So, if this is the desired effect, one should build the south side higher so as not to shut off the winter sun, and the north side lower so as to avoid exposure to the cold winds. In short, the most pleasant and fine residence is likely to be that which offers at all seasons the most agreeable retreat for the owner and the safest repository for his possessions. Frescoes and decorations deprive us of more amenities than they supply. As for temples and altars, he said that the most suitable site for them was one that was at once conspicuous and off the beaten track. It was pleasant for passers-by to say their prayers upon seeing a shrine, but it was also pleasant to approach it in a reverent frame of mind. On another occasion he was asked whether courage was a matter of teaching or a natural gift. One thing he said, that just as one body is born with more strength than another for doing work, so one mind is naturally endowed with greater fortitude than another for facing danger. For I'll observe that people who are brought up under the same laws and customs differ greatly in courage. But I think that every natural disposition can be developed in the direction of fortitude by instruction and application. It's obvious that the Scythians and Thracians would never dare to take shields and spears and fight it out with the Spartans. And it is evident that the Spartans would refuse to join mortal combat either with light shields and javelins against the Thracians or with bows and arrows against the Scythians. My personal experience is that similarly in all other cases people both differ in natural capacity and improve greatly by the help of application. From this it clearly follows that everyone, whether his natural ability is above or below the average, ought to study and exercise any qualities for which he wishes to earn recognition. He did not distinguish wisdom from prudence, but judged that the man who recognizes and puts into practice what is truly good, and the man who knows and guards against what is disgraceful, are both wise and prudent. When somebody asked him if he thought that those who understood what they ought to do, but did the opposite, were wise and weak, he replied, no more than I think them both unwise and weak. I presume that everyone acts by choosing from the courses open to him the one which he supposes to be most expedient. So I think that those who act wrongly are neither wise nor prudent. He used to say that not only justice, but all the other moral virtues were wisdom. Just actions and any others proceeding from a virtuous motive were truly good. Those who knew how to do them would choose to do nothing else, and those who did not understand them could not do them, and, if they tried to, failed. Thus it was the wise who performed truly good actions, those who were not wise could not, and, if they tried to, failed. So, since just actions and all other good and honorable deeds were all done from a virtuous motive, obviously both justice and all the other moral virtues were wisdom. He also said that madness was contrary to wisdom. Yet he did not think that mere lack of knowledge was madness, but to be ignorant of oneself, and to form opinions about and think that one comprehends what one does not know. This in his view was very near to madness. He said that most people did not consider that those who blundered about things that were generally unknown were crazy, but they called those crazy who were mistaken about things that were generally known. If a man thinks that he is so tall that he stoops as he goes out through the city gates, or so strong that he tries to pick up houses or attempts any other feat which is quite obviously impossible, he is called crazy, but those who are only a little mistaken are not generally considered to be crazy. Just as it is only a strong desire that is called love, so it is only a serious abnormality that is called madness. Considering the nature of envy, he concluded that it was a species of distress, but not the sort that arises over the misfortunes of friends or the good fortune of enemies. He said that only those people were envious who were distressed at the success of their friends. When some people expressed surprise that anyone who cared for a person should be vexed at his success, he reminded them that many people are so disposed towards certain others that they cannot ignore their troubles, but go to their help when they are unfortunate, and yet are annoyed when they are fortunate. This, he said, could not indeed happen to a sensible person, but was the constant experience of the foolish. Considering the nature of leisure, he said that he found that most people occupied themselves in some way, because even playing drafts or making jokes was a kind of occupation. But all such people were, he said, at leisure in the sense that it was possible for them to go on to do something better. But nobody had leisure to go from better to worse. And if anyone did so, that person, he said, had no leisure and was occupying himself wrongly. He said that it was not those who held the scepter who were kings and rulers, nor those who were chosen by unauthorized persons, nor those who were appointed by lot, nor those who had gained their position by force or fraud, but those who knew how to rule. when anyone agreed that it was for the ruler to lay down what ought to be done and for the subject to obey, he used to point out that in a ship it is the man who knows that takes command and the owner and everybody else on board obeys. The man who knows that in farming those who possess land, in illness those who are ill, in physical training those who are exercising their bodies, and all other persons who have anything that needs attention, if they think that they have the necessary knowledge, look after themselves. But otherwise they not only follow the advice of experts, if they are on the spot, but call in their help if they are not, so that, by taking their advice, they may follow the right course. And he pointed out that in the case of wool spinning, women actually exercise control over men, because they know how to do the work and the men do not. If anyone objected that a despot can disregard good advice, he used to reply, how can he, when there is a penalty for disregarding it? For in any case where a person disregards good advice he will presumably go wrong, and in going wrong he will pay the penalty. And if anyone objected that a despot has the power even to put the wise man to death, one he said, do you suppose that the man who puts to death his most effective allies goes unpunished or pays only a trivial penalty? Which do you think that a person who acts in this way would be more likely to do, find safety or precipitate his ruin? When he was asked what he thought was the best occupation for a man, he replied, effective action, and when he was further asked whether he considered good luck to be an occupation, he replied, regard luck and action is totally opposed to each other. I consider that coming upon something that you need without looking for it is good luck, but to do a thing well after learning and practicing how to do it is, I think, effective action. And it is those who make a practice of this who seem to me to be effective. He used to say that in every sphere of action those people were best and most favored by the gods who did their work effectively, whether in farming or in medicine or in politics, while the man who did nothing effectively was neither good for anything nor favored by the gods. 10. Again, whenever he talked to those craftsmen who practiced their craft professionally, he was helpful to them too. When one day he paid a call on the painter Parasius, he asked him, would you say, Parasius, that painting is representing things that one sees? You painters represent with your pigments and copy hollows and heights, darkness and light, hard and soft, rough and smooth, young bodies and old ones. That's true. Also, when you are painting beautiful figures, as it isn't easy to come across one single human being who is beyond criticism in every detail, you combine the best features of a number of people, and so convey the appearance of bodies which are entirely beautiful. Yes, that is what we do. Well now, do you represent the mind's character, which is the most attractive and pleasing and appealing and desirable and lovable part of us? Or is it not a subject for representation at all? How could it be, Socrates, when it has neither shape nor color nor any of the other qualities that you mentioned just now, and is not even visible at all? Tell me, then, can a person look at other people in a friendly or unfriendly manner? One would say so. Then can this be represented in their expressions? 1. Certainly. Do you think that those who care about their friends, good and bad fortune, wear the same expressions on their faces as those who don't? I know, indeed, they look glad at their friends, good fortune, and dejected at their misfortune. Is it possible to depict this too? 1. Certainly. Then again, dignity and freedom, meanness and slavishness, discipline and discretion, insolence and vulgarity, all show themselves both in the face and in the gestures of still and moving subjects. True. Can one represent these too? 1. Certainly. Do you think it's more pleasant to see people who exhibit fine, good and admirable characters, or those who exhibit base, bad and odious ones? 11. There's really no comparison, Socrates. On another day he called on Cleto the sculptor and got into conversation with him. One can see and appreciate, Cleto, the beauty you produce in your runners, wrestlers, boxers and pancratiasts. But the quality of seeming alive, how do you produce this in your statues? 1. Cleto didn't reply at once, because he didn't know what to say. Perhaps, said Socrates, you make your statues more lifelike by reproducing the appearance of living models. Yes, indeed. Do you make the various parts of the body seem more lifelike and convincing by representing them as concave or convex, compressed or expanded, tautened or relaxed, according to the posture? 1. Certainly. But doesn't it in fact afford some pleasure also to see represented the feelings of people in action? P1. Suppose so, so you should represent the expression of warriors as threatening, and the faces of victors should be made to look joyful. Definitely. In that case, concluded Socrates, the sculptor ought to make his works correspond to the type of character represented. He called on Pistias the armorer, and on being shown some well-made corselets, he said, it is most emphatically a splendid idea, Pistias, that the corselet should protect the parts of a man's body that need protection without preventing him from using his hands. But tell me, Pistias, why is it that you charge higher price than other makers for your corselets, although they are no stronger and cost no more? To because mine are better proportioned, Socrates. And do you put a higher price on your corselets because their proportion is demonstrable by their measurements or their weight? I presume that you don't make them all in the same or even in similar proportions, if you make them to fit. Oh, yes I do, he said. A corselet is no good without proportion. Surely some people's bodies are well proportioned and some badly. Quite so. Then how do you make a corselet that fits a badly proportioned body well proportioned? In the same way as I make it to fit a corselet that fits is well proportioned. It seems to me, said Socrates, that you are using the term well proportioned not absolutely, but in relation to the wearer, as you might say that a shield or a cloak is well proportioned for anyone that it fits. And the same, apparently, applies to everything else by your account. But perhaps fitting implies another important advantage. Tell me, Socrates, what's your point? 1. A corselet that fits irks one less by its weight than an equally heavy one that doesn't fit. A badly fitting corselet either hangs entirely from the shoulders or presses severely on some other part of the body, and that makes it clumsy and uncomfortable. A well-fitting one has its weight distributed both over the collarbone and shoulder blades and over the shoulders, chest, back and abdomen, so that it seems almost more like an appendage than something to carry. That's exactly why I think my products give the best value. Some people, though, prefer to buy decorated and gilded corselets. All the same, said Socrates, if the consequence is that they buy misfits, it seems to me that they pay dearly for their decoration and gilding. But here's another point. The body doesn't always stay the same. Sometimes it's bent and sometimes upright. How can precisely shaped corselets always fit? 1. They can't possibly. When you talk of fitting, you mean not what is precisely shaped, but what is not uncomfortable to use. You take the words out of my mouth, Socrates, and your grasp of the point is quite correct. At one time there was in the city a beautiful woman called Theodote, who was of the sort to consort with anyone persuasive. One of the company had mentioned her, and remarked that her beauty was beyond description. He added that artists visited her to paint her picture, and that she let them see as much of her as was proper. We ought to go and see her, said Socrates. We can't form a clear idea about what is beyond description from hearsay. The sooner you all come with me, the better, said the informant. So they went off to Theodote, found her posing for a painter, and took a good look at her. When the painter had finished, Socrates said, Gentlemen, ought we to be more grateful to Theodote for letting us see her beauty, or she to us for looking at her? I suggest that, if the display has been more to her advantage, she ought to be grateful to us, and if the sight has been more to ours, we ought to be grateful to her. Somebody said, That's right. Well then, he went on, she is already enjoying the tribute of our admiration, and when we have spread our report, she will benefit still further. On the other hand, we are now desirous of touching what we have seen. We shall go away with our emotions titillated. And when we have gone, we shall feel an unsatisfied longing. The natural inference from this is that we are performing the service and she is receiving it. One must say, said Theodote, if that's how it is, I should have to be grateful to you for looking at me. Socrates could see that she was expensively got up, and that she had her mother with her, dressed and arrayed in no casual manner, and several pretty maids in attendance, who similarly showed no signs of neglect. And that the house was lavishly appointed in all other respects. So he now said, Tell me, Theodote, have you got a farm? 1. Not I, she said. Well then, a house that brings in money? 1. No, a house. Perhaps you have some slaves who work at a craft? 1. No, none. Then how do you support yourself? If anyone gets friendly with me and wants to be generous, that's how I get my living. Good heavens, Theodote, said Socrates, it's a splendid asset to have a flock of friends, much better than having a flock of sheep and goats and cattle. But tell me, do you leave it to chance whether a friend wings his way towards you, like a fly, or do you devise something yourself? How could L find a device to bring that about? 1. She asked. You could do it much more naturally than a spider. You know how spiders hunt to support themselves. They spin fine webs and feed on anything that flies into them. Are you advising me to weave some kind of snare too? 1. She asked. No, you mustn't expect to hunt friends, who are the most valuable prey of all, as simply as that. Don't you see that even in hunting common game like hares, people use various methods? In the first place, hares feed by night, so the hunters provide themselves with hounds trained for night work, and hunt them with ease. Then, because hares run away from their feeding grounds when day comes, they acquire other hounds which find them by picking up the scent from the trail that they leave from the feeding grounds to their forms. Then, because they are swift-footed, so that they can escape by running even when sighted, the hunters further supply themselves with swift hounds to run them down. And because some of the hares escape even from these, nets are set up in their escape paths, so that the hares may run into them and get entangled. Well, said Theodote, what method like that might I use to catch friends? 1. Surely by providing yourself with a human hound, who will track down men of wealth and good taste, and, after finding them, devise a means of driving them into your nets. Nets? I, said she. What nets have I got? 1. Certainly, said Socrates, which is very close in folding, your body. And in it is your mind, which teaches you how to look charming and talk gaily, and tells you that you must give a warm welcome to an attentive lover, but bolt the door against a selfish one. That, if a lover falls ill, you must look after him devotedly. That, if he has a stroke of luck, you must share his pleasure enthusiastically. And that, if he cares for you deeply, you must gratify him wholeheartedly. As for loving, I am sure that you know how to love not only passively, but with real affection. And you convince your lovers that you are fond of them, I know, not by words but by deeds. Honestly, said Theodote, 1. Don't use any of these methods. Then again, said Socrates, it's much better to keep one's human relationships natural and right. You can't capture or keep a friend by force. But by showing the creature kindness and giving it pleasure, you can both catch it and keep it by you. That's true, she said. So in the first place, said Socrates, when people care for you, you should make only such demands of them as they can satisfy with a minimum of trouble. Then, you should repay their favors in kind. In this way they are likely to become most attached to you, to go on loving you for the longest time, and to be most generous to you. And you are likely to give them most pleasure if you bestow what you have to give only when they ask for it. You can see that even the most delightful dishes seem disagreeable if they are served before the appetite is ready, and if one is satiated, they actually cause disgust. But even inferior food seems quite attractive if it is served after hunger has been aroused. Very well, said she, how am I to arouse hunger for what I have to give? 1. Why, surely, said Socrates, if, when your admirers are satiated, you neither offer nor hint at your favors, until the satisfaction has passed and they feel the want again. And next, when they most feel the want, if you drop hints by a combination of the most modest behavior and obviously wanting to gratify them, and by obviously holding back until their need is as great as possible, for the same favors are much better than before the desire for them is aroused. Theodote said, why don't you help me in my hunt for friends, Socrates? 1 will, believe me, said Socrates, if you persuade me. How can I persuade you? 1 You'll look to that yourself, he said, and you will find a way. If you need any help from me, then come and see me often, she said. Well, Theodote, replied Socrates, poking fun at his own avoidance of public life, it's not very easy for me to find the time for it. I have a great deal of private and public business that keeps me occupied. And I have some girlfriends too, who will never let me leave them by day or night, because they are learning from me about love charms and spells. Do you really know about them too, Socrates? 1 She asked, why do you suppose that Apollodorus here and Antisthenes never leave me? And that Cebes and Simmias come to visit me from Thebes? You may be sure that these things don't happen without a lot of love charms and spells and magic wheels. Lend me your magic wheel, then, so that I may spin it first for you. Certainly not, he said. 1 Don't want to be drawn to you. I want you to come to me. Very well, I will, she declared. Only mind you let me in. Yes, I'll let you in, said Socrates, unless I have someone with me that I like better. 12 Seeing that Epigenes, one of his companions, was in poor physical condition for a young man, he said, you're out of training, Epigenes. 1 Don't do physical training, Socrates, he replied, but you ought to, just as much as a prospective competitor at the Olympian Games. Or do you think that the mortal struggle against her enemies in which Athens will sooner or later involve you doesn't matter? And yet in the hazards of war, it's not uncommon for people to lose their lives through lack of fitness, or to save it only ignominiously. For the same reason, many are captured alive, and once captured either spend the rest of their lives, perhaps, in the bitterest servitude, or, after being subjected to the most cruel duress and paying in some cases a ransom greater than the sum of their possessions, live out their lives in want and misery. Many too win a bad reputation because their physical debility makes them seem to shirk danger. Perhaps you don't take these penalties of unfitness seriously, and assume that you can easily put up with that sort of thing? In my view, at any rate, the prospects that await a man who cares about his physical fitness are much easier and more pleasant. Or perhaps you think that unfitness is both healthier and in general more good for you than fitness, or are scornful of the results that fitness brings? In point of fact, the consequences of keeping oneself fit are entirely contrary to those of failing to do so in the first place. Those who keep themselves fit are healthy and strong. And this means that many of them come through the conflicts of war with honor, and escape from all its dangers. Many help their friends and do service to their country, and so earn gratitude and win great glory and achieve the most splendid honors, and consequently live out their lives with greater pleasure and distinction, and leave behind them better start in life for their children. The fact that our country does not conduct military training at public expense is no reason for individuals to neglect it. They should regard it no less seriously. You can take it from me that there is no other feat of endurance either. In fact, there is no activity of any kind in which you will be at a disadvantage from having your body better prepared. The body is valuable for all human activities, and in all its uses it is very important that it should be as fit as possible. Even in the act of thinking, which is supposed to require least assistance from the body, everyone knows that serious mistakes often happen through physical ill health. Many people's minds are often so invaded by forgetfulness, despondency, irritability and insanity because of their poor physical condition that their knowledge is actually driven out of them. On the other hand, those who are in good physical condition have ample cause for confidence and run no risk of any such misfortune through debility. Their physical fitness is likely to contribute towards results that are contrary to those of unfitness, results which a sane man would surely endure any hardships to secure. Besides, it is a shame to let yourself grow old through neglect before seeing how you can develop the maximum beauty and strength of body. And you can't have this experience if you are negligent, because these things don't normally happen by themselves. 13 Once, when somebody was angry because another person did not return his greeting, Socrates said, it's funny that, although you wouldn't have been angry if you had met a person in a rather poor physical state, it upsets you to come across one in a rather rude state of mind. Somebody else said that he took no pleasure in eating. Achaemenus can tell you a good cure for that, said Socrates. What sort of cure? One asked the other to give up eating. Once you've done that, you'll find life not only more pleasant, but cheaper and healthier. On another occasion, somebody else complained that the drinking water at his house was warm. Then whenever you want a warm bath, it'll be ready for you, but it's too cold to wash in. Do your slaves object to drinking it and washing in it? Not at all, said the man. In fact, I've been surprised to see how contentedly they use it for both purposes. Which is warmer to drink, the water in your house or the water in the temple of Asclepius? The water in the temple of Asclepius. And which is the colder for bathing, yours or the water at the shrine of Amphiaraus? 13 The water at the shrine of Amphiaraus. You should reflect, then, said Socrates, that you look like being more fussy than a slave or an invalid. A man had punished his retainer severely, and Socrates asked why he was angry with his servant. Because he's as lazy as he is greedy, and as shy of work as he is fond of money, replied the man. Have you ever considered which of you needs the bigger thrashing? You or your servant? Once somebody was afraid of traveling to Olympia. Why are you afraid of the journey? Asked Socrates. Don't you spend nearly the whole day walking when you're at home? On your way to Olympia, you will walk for a while and then have lunch. Then walk for another while. Have dinner and go to bed. Don't you realize that if you joined together, end to end, the walks that you take in 5 or 6 days, you would easily cover the distance from Athens to Olympia? Besides, it is pleasanter to start a day too soon than to arrive too late, because it is awkward to be forced to lengthen the stages of your journey too much. But to increase the time of the journey by 1 day makes for considerable ease. So it's better to hurry over the start than on the journey. When someone else said that he was exhausted after making a long journey, Socrates asked him whether he was carrying baggage too. Good heavens, no, he said, only my coat. Were you traveling alone? Asked Socrates, or did you have a servant with you? One, yes, I had. Was he empty-handed or carrying something? One, carrying my bedding, naturally, and my other belongings. And how did he get through the journey? Better than I did, I should say. Well, now, said Socrates, if you had had to carry his luggage, what sort of state do you think you would have been in? One, very poor, or rather, I couldn't have brought it at all. Do you really think it's natural for a fit man to be so much less capable of effort than a boy servant? 114. When there was a communal dinner and some of the party brought more food than others, Socrates used to tell his servant either to pool the smaller contributions or to distribute them in equal shares. The result was that those who brought a large quantity felt ashamed to refuse a share of the pooled food and also felt ashamed to keep their food to themselves. So they put their food into the pool too. And since they got no more than those who brought a small quantity, they gave up spending large sums on food. On one occasion, Socrates noticed that one of the company at dinner had stopped eating bread and was eating the savories by themselves. As the conversation was about the proper application of names to occupations, Socrates said, "Can we say, gentlemen, what sort of conduct gets a man called a savory eater? Of course, everybody eats savories with his bread if he's got any, but I presume that this is not enough to earn the name of savory eater." "No, indeed," said one of the company. "Well, now," he went on, "if somebody eats savories by themselves, without bread, not with a view to training but for pleasure, do you think he is a savory eater or not?" One, there could hardly be a better claim to the title. Another member of the company said, "What about a man who eats a great deal of savories with a little bread?" "In my view," said Socrates, "it would be fair to call him a savory eater too. And when everyone else is praying to the gods for plentiful crops, I suppose he would pray for plentiful savories." When Socrates said this, the young man realized that the discussion had been aimed at him and, although he did not stop eating the savories, he took bread with them. Observing this, Socrates said, "One, want you who are sitting near him to watch and see whether he will treat the bread as savory or the savories as bread." He once saw another of his dinner companions sampling several kinds of savory with one piece of bread. Could there be, he asked, a form of gastronomy more extravagant or more ruinous of good food than is practiced by a person who eats several dishes at once and puts all kinds of flavors into his mouth at the same time? By combining more ingredients than his cooks use, he is acting rather extravagantly, and since he combines what they refuse to combine, as being incompatible, then, if they are right, he is wrong, and is desecrating their art. And yet it is surely absurd for a man to engage the most expert cooks and then interfere with their menus when he doesn't even profess the art in question. Besides, there's another thing that happens to a man who has made a habit of eating several kinds of food at once. If he hasn't got several kinds, he is likely to feel discontented through missing what he is accustomed to. On the other hand, a man who had made a habit of helping down one piece of bread with one kind of savory could be content with one kind if more were not available. He also used to say that in the Athenian dialect good living was synonymous with eating, and that the qualification good referred to eating foods which were innocuous to both mind and body, and not difficult to procure. Thus he regarded even good living as the privilege of those whose lives are well ordered. Book 4. Socrates was so helpful in every activity and in every way that anyone who considers the matter and estimates it fairly must see that nothing was more profitable than associating with Socrates and spending one's time with him in any place or circumstances. Indeed, even to recall him, now that he is gone, is no small help to those who were his habitual companions, and to accept his views. His influence on his companions was just as salutary in his lighter moments as when he was serious. He would often say that he loved somebody, but anyone could see that he was drawn not towards those endowed with physical attractiveness, but towards those endowed with mental virtue. He inferred that they had natural talent from their learning quickly anything to which they applied their minds, and remembering what they had learned, and from their eagerness for any kind of instruction that enables one to manage an estate or a community efficiently, and in general to be successful in one's dealings with people and in one's management of human affairs. He thought that people of this sort, when trained, would not only be happy themselves and manage their estates well, but would be able to make other persons and communities happy too. He did not approach everyone in the same way. If people thought that they were naturally talented and were scornful of instruction, he explained to them that the natures which are regarded as the best have the greatest need of training. He pointed out that the best bred horses are spirited and impetuous, and that if they are broken in when they are quite young, they become more manageable and better than any others. But if they grow up unbroken, they are very difficult to control and worse than any others. Again, pedigree puppies, which are tireless and eager to attack their prey, become very good hounds and most serviceable for hunting, if they are properly trained. But if they grow up untrained, they become wild and erratic and very difficult to control. In the same way, the best types of men, people with exceptional strength of mind and ability to carry through whatever they undertake, if they are educated and learn to do their duty, become excellent and most useful people, because they perform a great many important services. But if they grow up uneducated and ignorant, they turn out worse and cause more harm than anybody. Not knowing how to decide where their duty lies, they often set their hands to wicked deeds. And since they are proud and impetuous, they are difficult to restrain or divert from their course, and consequently they commit a great many serious crimes. As for those who were proud of their wealth and thought that they had no need of education as well, but assumed that their riches would be quite enough to secure for them any result that they wanted and to win the esteem of their fellow men, he tried to put sense into them by saying that a man was a fool if he expected to be able to distinguish beneficial and harmful activities without learning how to do so. And a fool if, unable to draw this distinction, but using his wealth to procure whatever he wanted, he nevertheless thought that he would be able to act to his own advantage. And if he could not act to his own advantage, it was stupid to think that he was fortunate and well or adequately equipped for life, and also stupid to think that he would be considered good for anything because of his wealth if he had no knowledge, or that he would enjoy popularity if he was considered good for nothing. I shall next describe what his attitude was towards those who thought that they had received the best education and prided themselves on their wisdom. He discovered that the handsome Euthydemus had collected a great many writings of the best known poets and sages, and that consequently he now considered himself to be more enlightened than anyone of his age group, and entertained high hopes of becoming unrivaled in eloquence and administrative ability. So first of all, realizing that because of his youth Euthydemus did not yet go into the agora if he wanted to conduct any business, but took up his position in a saddler's shop close by, Socrates went to the shop himself with some of his friends. Someone opened the conversation by inquiring whether it was through association with one of the sages or by natural talent that Themistocles rose so far above his fellow citizens that the state looked to him whenever it needed a man of action. Socrates wanted to stir up Euthydemus, so he replied that it was silly to imagine that, although the lesser arts were not practiced seriously without the help of competent teachers, the art of public administration, which was the greatest accomplishment of all, came to people of its own accord on another occasion when Euthydemus was present. Socrates noticed that he was withdrawing from the group and taking care not to seem impressed by Socrates' wisdom. "Gentlemen," he said, "it is easy to see from the way in which our friend Euthydemus spends his time that, when he is old enough, he won't refrain from advising the state on any political issue that comes up. And it seems to me that by carefully avoiding the appearance of learning anything from anybody, he has provided himself with a splendid preface to his public speeches. Evidently, when he begins to speak, he will introduce what he has to say like this: Gentlemen of Athens, I have never learned anything from anybody, nor have I sought the company of any person whose abilities in speech and action I had heard of, nor have I troubled to acquire a teacher from among those who understand these matters. On the contrary, I have consistently avoided not only learning anything from anybody, but even giving the impression of doing so. However, I shall offer you whatever advice occurs to me of its own accord." Such an introduction would be appropriate for candidates applying for a public medical post. They could suitably begin their speech in this way: Gentlemen of Athens, I have never learned medicine from anyone, nor have I tried to secure any doctor as a teacher. I have consistently avoided not only learning anything from medical men, but even giving the impression of having learned this art. However, I'll ask you to give me this medical post. I shall try to learn by experimenting on you." This introduction made everyone present laugh. It was now obvious that Euthydemus was paying attention to what Socrates was saying, although he was still careful not to say anything himself, thinking by his silence to invest himself with an air of discretion. Socrates wanted to stop him behaving like this, and said, "You know how people who want to be competent performers on a stringed or wind instrument, or on horseback, or in any other similar skill, try to practice the desired accomplishment as continuously as possible, not only by themselves but under the supervision of acknowledged experts, and go to all lengths and put up with anything, just so long as these experts approve of all they do, because they feel that they cannot otherwise become worthwhile practitioners of their art. I'll find it astonishing that, on the other hand, some of those who wish to become proficient in public speaking and administration expect to be able suddenly to do this of their own accord without preparation or application. Yet political proficiency seems to be harder to achieve than the other kinds, inasmuch as more people pursue political ends and fewer achieve them. So obviously political ambition calls for more and closer application than other kinds." Socrates began by making observations of this sort in the hearing of Euthydemus. When he noticed that Euthydemus was putting up with his comments more readily and listening with greater interest, he went alone to the saddler's shop, and, when Euthydemus sat down near him, said, "Tell me, Euthydemus, is it true what I hear, that you have collected a large number of books by reputed experts?" "One indeed it is," Socrates replied. "Euthydemus, and I'm still adding to the collection, until I've got as many as I can." "One really do admire you for preferring to stockpile wisdom rather than silver and gold," said Socrates. "Evidently you think that silver and gold make people know better, whereas the maxims of the wise enrich their possessors with moral goodness." Euthydemus cheered up as he heard this, thinking that Socrates approved of his method of pursuing wisdom. But when Socrates noted that he was pleased at this commendation, he said, "What exactly is it that you want to become good at, Euthydemus, by collecting these books?" When Euthydemus remained silent, wondering what he should reply, Socrates went on, "Can it be medicine? There are a great many treatises written by doctors." "That's not my idea at all," said Euthydemus. "Perhaps you want to become an architect? That's another profession that calls for a skilled mind." "No, I don't want to become an architect." "Perhaps you are keen to become a good geometrician, like Theodorus?" 11. Not that either, he said. "Perhaps you want to be an astronomer?" When he denied this too, Socrates asked, "Perhaps a rhapsode? They say that you have got all the poems of Homer." "Certainly not," he said. Know that rhapsodes are word perfect, but they have very little intelligence themselves." At this Socrates said, "You don't mean to tell me, Euthydemus, that you are aiming at the kind of proficiency that makes people politicians and administrators and capable of governing, and helpful both to others and themselves?" I am very anxious to acquire this kind of proficiency," replied Euthydemus. "Good heavens!" Said Socrates. "It's a most splendid and important art that you have set your heart on. It's the province of kings, and is called the art of kingship. But have you satisfied yourself whether it is possible to become good at these things without being morally good?" "Certainly I have," he said, "and it's impossible to become even a good citizen without moral goodness." "Well," said Socrates, "have you achieved this?" Think, Socrates, that I should prove to be as moral a man as anyone. "Well then, do moral men have products in the same way that carpenters do?" Yes, they have. "Carpenters can display their products. Men give an account of theirs too?" Can moral. "Are you suggesting," said Euthydemus, "that I can't give an account of the products of morality?" "I'll assure you that I can do it for the products of immorality too. There are plenty of them to be seen and heard every day." "Look here," said Socrates, "shall we write an R here and a W there, and then put down whatever we think is a right thing to do under R and whatever we think is wrong under W?" If you think there's any point, do it." Socrates wrote the letters as he had suggested, and then said, "Is there such a thing in human life as telling?" "Yes, there is." "On which side shall we put that?" "Obviously under wrong." "Is there such a thing as deception?" Certainly." "On which side shall we put that?" "Obviously that too, under wrong." "What about doing harm?" That too. "And enslaving?" That too. "And shall we list none of these under right, Euthydemus?" "I know, that would be shocking." "Well now, suppose that a man who has been appointed to a military command reduces a wicked and hostile city to slavery. Shall we say that he is acting wrongly? Of course not. Shall we not say that he is acting rightly? Certainly. And supposing that he deceives them in fighting against them? That is right too. And if he steals and plunders their possessions, will he not be acting rightly? Certainly, he said. Thought at first that you were asking about these actions only in relation to friends, so perhaps all the things that we have put under wrong ought to be put under right too. It looks like it. Now that we have settled that, shall we revise our definition and say that it is right to do this sort of thing to enemies, but wrong to do it to friends, and that to the latter one should be as straightforward as possible? Is that what you wish?" "Very much so," said Euthydemus. "Well then," said Socrates, "supposing that a general sees that his force is downhearted and issues a false statement that help is approaching, and by this falsehood restores the morale of his men, on which side shall we put this deceit?" Think under right. "And supposing that someone has a son who needs medical treatment and refuses to take his medicine, if the father surreptitiously gives him the medicine in his food and by this artifice restores him to health, where should we put this example of deceit?" Think in the same category. "Well now, supposing that someone has a friend who is in a state of depression, and is afraid that he will do away with himself. And supposing that he covertly or openly removes a sword or some other weapon from him, in which column should we put this?" Surely this ought to go under right too. "Do you mean that we ought not always to deal straightforwardly even with our friends?" Of course we shouldn't," he said. I am revising my earlier statement, if that's all right." "Well, that's much better than putting things in the wrong categories," said Socrates. "But take the case of those who deceive their friends to their detriment so as not to leave even this aspect unconsidered. Which is the worse morally, to do it voluntarily or involuntarily?" 11. Well, Socrates, I've lost confidence in my answers. Everything that I said before seems to be different now from what I thought then. However, take it that I say that voluntary is worse than involuntary deception. Do you think that one can learn and understand morality as one can the alphabet? Yes, I do. Who do you consider to be more literate, the man who deliberately reads or writes wrongly, or the man who does it involuntarily? The former, I think, because he could do the same thing correctly if he wanted to, so the man who deliberately writes incorrectly would be literate, and the one who does it involuntarily would be illiterate. Of course, who knows what is right and deceives voluntarily, or the one who does so involuntarily? The former. Obviously, you hold that the man who knows his alphabet is more literate than the one who doesn't? The man who lies, yes. And that the man who knows what is right is morally better than the one who doesn't? Obviously. I think that is, in a sense, implied in what I said. Well now, take the man who wants to tell the truth, but never says the same about the same things. In describing the same route, he calls it sometimes eastward and sometimes westward, and, in totaling up an account, he makes the same total now bigger and now smaller. What do you think of him? His is a clear case of not knowing what he thought he knew. You know that there are people whom we call slavish. Yes. Because of their wisdom or because of their ignorance? Obviously because of their ignorance. Is it because they are ignorant of metalwork that they get their description? Of course not. Ignorant of carpentry, then? Not that either. Well, of cobbling, none of those reasons. Just the opposite. Most of the people who understand these crafts are slavish. Then does this name apply to those who don't know what is honorable and good and right? 1. So I believe, in that case, we ought to make every effort to avoid being slavish. 1. Swear, Socrates said Euthydemus, one really thought that I was following a philosophy of life which would give me the right sort of education for one whose object is true goodness. But now you can't think how depressed I feel when I see that my past efforts have left me unable to answer questions even about the most important subjects, and with no other course available by which I can make myself better. Socrates said, tell me, Euthydemus, have you ever been to Delphi? 1. Yes indeed, twice. Did you notice the inscription know yourself somewhere near the shrine? 1. Yes, I did. Did you ignore the inscription, or did you pay attention to it and try to examine what sort of person you were? 1. Good heavens. 1. He said. No, I didn't. You see, that was one thing I thought I did know. I could hardly have known anything else if I hadn't even been acquainted with myself. Who do you think knows himself, the man who merely knows his own name, or the one who behaves like people buying a horse? They don't consider that they know a horse in which they are interested until they have satisfied themselves whether it's obedient or disobedient, strong or weak, swift or slow, and how it stands with respect to all the other qualities which make a horse desirable or undesirable as regards its usefulness. And the man thinking of has in the same way ascertained his own ability by examining his own qualifications in respect of human relationships. To my mind, the man who doesn't know his own ability is ignorant of himself. And isn't this obvious, said Socrates, that people derive most of their benefits from knowing themselves, and most of their misfortunes from being self-deceived? Those who know themselves know what is appropriate for them and can distinguish what they can and cannot do. And, by doing what they understand, they both supply their needs and enjoy success, while, by refraining from doing things that they don't understand, they avoid making mistakes and escape misfortune. Self-knowledge also enables them to assess others. And it is through their relations with others that they provide themselves with what is good and guard against what is bad for them. Those who do not know themselves and are totally deceived about their own abilities are in the same position whether they are dealing with other people or any other aspect of human affairs. They don't know what they want or what they are doing or what means they are using. And, through making gross mistakes about all these, they miss the good things and get into trouble. People who know what they are doing succeed in their activities and become famous and respected. Those who are like them gladly associate with them, while those who are unsuccessful in their affairs are anxious for these men to make decisions for them and to represent their interests, and pin to them their hopes of prosperity, and for all these reasons regard them with special affection. But those who don't know what they are doing make bad choices and fail in whatever they attempt, and so not only suffer loss and retribution in respect of these actions, but damage their reputation in consequence, get themselves laughed at, and live despised and unhonored. You can see, too, that any states which have gone to war with stronger ones through not knowing their own capability either lose their territory or exchange freedom for slavery. Euthydemus said, you can take it from me, Socrates, that I quite recognize the importance of knowing oneself. But I am looking to you in the hope that you may be willing to explain to me at what point one should begin self-examination. You are quite clear in your mind, I suppose, said Socrates, what things are good and what are bad. Certainly, he said. If I don't even know that, I should be worse off than slavish people. Come on, then, and expound them to me. Well, that's not difficult. In the first place, I think that health is a good thing in itself, and sickness and evil then, the things conducive to each of these drinks and foods and occupations that promote health, are good, and those that cause illness are bad, so even health and illness may be good things when they have a good result and bad when they have a bad one. When could health have a bad result and disease a good one? 1. Why, to be sure, said Socrates, in the case of a shameful expedition or a disastrous voyage or many other such events, when those who have taken part because they were able-bodied have perished, while those who have been excluded by infirmity have escaped. 11. True. But you see that in the case of beneficial activities too, some people participate through fitness and others are excluded by infirmity. Then, if these things are sometimes beneficial and sometimes harmful, are they any more good than bad? Not a bit, it seems, according to your argument. But surely wisdom, Socrates, is beyond all question a good thing. What action is there that a person would not perform better if he were wise than if he were ignorant? 1. Why, haven't you heard of Daedalus, said Socrates, how he was captured by Minos because of his skill and compelled to serve him, and was deprived at the same time of his country and of his liberty? And how, when he tried to escape with his son, he both lost the boy and didn't even reach safety himself, but was carried away into a foreign country and there became a slave again? 11. That is certainly the story. And haven't you heard of the fate of Palamedes? All the poets sing of how he fell a victim to Odysseus' jealousy because of his cleverness. That again is the story, and how many other people do you think owe it to their cleverness that they have been carried off to the king of Persia, and served there as slaves? 13. It looks as if the most unquestionable good is happiness, Socrates, provided that it isn't composed of questionable goods. Euthydemus. Why, what constituent of happiness could be questionable? 1. None, unless we include in it beauty or strength or wealth or fame or something else of the kind, but we certainly shall include them. How could anyone be happy without them? 1. And that assure you including constituents from which many unpleasant consequences follow for mankind. Beauty often brings disaster through the excitement aroused by physical attraction. Strength is often the cause of no small downfall by inducing people to attempt tasks which are too much for them. Wealth often causes ruin through self-indulgence or the covetousness of others. Fame and political power often lead to great calamities. Really, said Euthydemus, if I'm not right in praising happiness either, I must admit that I don't even know what to pray to the gods for. Well, said Socrates, probably you haven't so much as considered the question, because you were so confident in your knowledge. But since you are proposing to be a leader in a city with a democratic government, obviously you know what a democratic government is. We shall be perfectly, of course. Do you think it's possible to know democratic government without knowing the people? 1. No, indeed I don't. So you know what the people is? 1 believe so, and what do you think the people is? The poor among the citizens, so you know the poor also? 1 Of course, then do you know the rich too? 1 No less well than the poor. What sorts of persons do you call poor and rich? 1 Suppose I call poor those who have not got enough to pay for what they need, and rich those who have more than enough. Have you noticed that some of those who have very little not only find it enough, but actually save out of it, and that for some a great many possessions are not enough? 11 Yes, indeed, said Euthydemus, you are quite right to remind me. I know even some despots who are driven to do wrong because they haven't enough, just like the neediest classes. Well then, said Socrates, granted that this is so, we shall class the despots among the people, and those who have few possessions among the rich, if they are good managers of their property. Euthydemus said, I'm forced to admit that too evidently the fault lies with my own incompetence. And am considering whether it may be best to keep my mouth shut. It looks as though I know absolutely nothing. He went away very much dejected, because he had come to despise himself and felt that he really was slavish. Many of those who were treated in this way by Socrates stopped going to see him. These he considered to lack resolution. But Euthydemus decided that he would never become a person of any importance unless he associated with Socrates as much as possible. And from that time onwards, he never left him unless he was obliged to, and he even copied some of Socrates' practices. When Socrates realized that Euthydemus was in this frame of mind, he stopped teasing him and explained as simply and precisely as he could what he thought it was necessary for Euthydemus to know, and what lines of action were best for him to follow. He was in no hurry for his associates to become eloquent or capable or inventive. He thought that they ought first to acquire a sense of responsibility, because he considered that without this the possession of those other faculties made them more unscrupulous and more capable of doing wrong in the first place. Then, he tried to make his associates think sensibly about religion. Different people were present at different discourses of his on this subject, and have tried to describe them. I was present when he was having the following discussion with Euthydemus. Tell me, Euthydemus, he said, has it ever occurred to you to reflect how carefully the gods have supplied all human needs? 1 No, as a matter of fact it hasn't, he replied. Well, do you realize that in the first place we need light, which the gods supply us? Certainly. Without it we should be no better than blind for all the good our eyes could do us. Then we also need rest. And they provide us with night as the best possible time for it. We ought to be very grateful for that too, and since the sun is bright and enables us to distinguish the times of the day, as well as everything else, while the night because of its darkness is more obscure, they have made stars shine in the night which inform us how the time is passing and so enable us to do many of the things that we need to do. Isn't that so? Yes, it is. Then the moon marks for us the divisions not only of the night, but also of the month. Quite so. There is also the fact that we need food, and the gods produce this from the earth, providing for the purpose appropriate seasons, which supply us not only with all kinds of things we need but also those things in which we find enjoyment. That is very kind of them too. And then there is the fact that they give us water, which is so precious that it helps the earth and the seasons to germinate and grow everything that is useful to us, and helps also to feed us ourselves, and by combining with all the things that feed us makes them more digestible and beneficial and agreeable. And because we need a great deal of it, they supply it in the greatest possible abundance. This too shows their forethought. And what about their providing us with fire as an ally against cold and darkness, and as a partner in every art and in all the things that people prepare for their own convenience? To put it briefly, of all the aids for living with which people equip themselves, not one of any importance is independent of fire. That is another outstanding example of kindness. And the fact that after the winter solstice the sun comes nearer, ripening some things and drying up others which have passed their prime. And that, after finishing this task, it comes no closer, but turns back for fear of injuring us by too much heat. And then when, as it recedes again, it reaches the point where even we can see that, if it recedes any further, we shall be frozen stiff by the cold, it turns again and approaches, so that it traverses just that part of the heavens in which it can do us most good. What about all this? Yes, indeed, he said, this too gives a very strong impression of happening for the benefit of mankind. And then, since it is also plain that we could not endure either the heat or the cold if it came on suddenly, what about the fact that the sun approaches and recedes so gradually that we don't notice that we are passing into either extreme of temperature? 1 I am wondering now, said Euthydemus, whether the gods have any function other than looking after men. My only difficulty is that the animals share these benefits as well. Naturally, said Socrates, because it's obvious, isn't it, that animals too are born and reared for the benefit of mankind? What other creature enjoys so many benefits as man does from goats, sheep, cattle, horses and donkeys? More, it seems to me, than from plants. At any rate, people obtain food and profit from the former, no less than from the latter. And there are many tribes which don't use the produce of the earth for food, but support themselves on the milk, cheese and flesh of their herds. And all nations tame and domesticate useful animals and employ their help for war and for many other purposes. One agree with you about that too. I'll observe that even those animals which are much stronger than ourselves are brought so far under human control that people use them just as they like, and what of the fact that they have equipped us with senses appropriate to the different kinds of beautiful and beneficial objects that surround us, so that by means of these senses we can enjoy all good things? And the fact that they have implanted in us reason, which enables us to think about and remember our sensations, and so discover the beneficial effects of each class of objects and devise various means for enjoying what is good and avoiding what is bad for us. Then there is their gift of communication, which enables us through instruction to share reciprocally with others everything that is good, and to enact laws and live in organized communities. There is every reason to suppose, Socrates, that the gods show great concern for human beings. Then there is their direct assistance in a sphere in which we are incompetent, that is, in foreseeing our future interests. By means of divination they reveal to those who consult them what is going to happen, and explain how it can be turned to the best advantage, and they seem to be on even friendlier terms with you than with others. Socrates, if it is true that they forewarn you what to do and what not to do without even being asked, 11 you will discover for yourself that what I say is true if, instead of waiting until you see the gods in physical form, you are content to worship and honor them on the evidence of their works. You should reflect that the gods intimate as much themselves. Other deities give us good gifts, but never reveal themselves in any act of giving. And in particular he who controls and regulates the whole universe, with all its good and beautiful contents, which he ceaselessly supplies for our use, fresh and healthy and unmarred by age, obeying his commands unfailingly and faster than thought, he can be seen to be carrying out the greatest works, but in the detailed administration he is invisible to our eyes. Reflect that the sun, which is supposed to be manifest to all, does not permit human beings to regard him directly. Anyone who attempts to observe him without due respect is deprived of sight. Even the agents of the gods, you will find, are invisible. The thunderbolt is obviously discharged from above and overcomes everything that it meets. But neither in its approach nor at the moment of impact nor in its withdrawal can it be seen. Winds are themselves invisible, but their effects are plain to us, and we can perceive their approach. Moreover, there is the human mind, which partakes of divinity if anything else human does. That it is the ruling part of us is evident, but even it cannot be seen. You should take this to heart, and not despise things that are unseen, but appreciate their power from their effects, and honor the divine. Speaking for myself, Socrates said, Euthydemus, 1 I am quite sure that I shall not disregard the divine even to a small degree. But what depresses me is that it seems to me that no human being could ever repay the goodness of the gods towards us by adequate gratitude. Don't feel depressed about that, Euthydemus, said Socrates. You can see that the god at Delphi, when he is asked how one can show gratitude to the gods, replies, by the law of the state, and I presume that it is the law everywhere to please the gods to the best of one's power by sacrificial offerings. Well then, how can we honor them better and more devoutly than by doing as they themselves direct? But one must not fall short of one's capacity. When a man does this, it is surely obvious that he is not honoring the gods. So if he consistently honors the gods to the best of his power, he may feel confident and expect the greatest blessings. It wouldn't be sensible to expect greater ones from any other source than from those who can grant the greatest benefits, or on any other ground than that of pleasing them. And how can one please them better than by the greatest possible obedience? One by enunciating such principles as these and by putting them into practice himself, he made his associates more devout and responsible as for his views about what is right. So far from concealing them, he demonstrated them by his actions in all his personal relationships. He was law-abiding and helpful. In public life he obeyed the authorities in respect of their lawful requirements, both in civil affairs and on military service, so punctiliously that he was conspicuous for exceptional obedience. When he was appointed president in the assembly, he did not permit the people to pass an illegal motion, but in support of the law he resisted a popular outburst which no other man, in my opinion, could have withstood. He disobeyed the illegal orders of the 30, first, when they forbade him to converse with the young, and second, when they instructed him, with some others, to arrest a citizen 3 for execution. He alone disobeyed on the ground that what he was ordered to do was illegal. When he was facing prosecution by Meletus, he rejected as illegal the usual practice in courts of law. All other accused persons used to address the jury ingratiatingly and flatter them and appeal to them illegally, and many of them by this sort of behavior often secured an acquittal. But although Socrates might easily have been acquitted if he had made even a moderate concession to common practice, he chose to abide by the law and die, rather than break it and live. He actually expressed these convictions on many occasions to others. And in particular, I know that one day he had the following discussion about right conduct with Hippias of Elis. Hippias had arrived at Athens after a long absence and joined Socrates just as he was saying to some of his friends how remarkable it was that if one wanted to have somebody taught cobbling or joinery or metalwork or horsemanship, there was no difficulty about knowing where to send him for this purpose. But if one wanted to learn oneself what is right, or to have a son or a slave taught this knowledge, one did not know where to go in order to get it. When Hippias heard this, he said playfully, "Dear me, Socrates, are you still saying the same things I heard you say all that time ago?" Socrates replied, "Yes, and what is even stranger, Hippias, I'm not only saying the same things but saying them about the same subjects. You, no doubt, because of your wide learning, never say the same thing about the same subject." Of course, he said, one always try to say something new, even about facts that you know. I mean, if somebody asks you how many letters there are in Socrates, and what they are, do you try to say something different now from what you said before? Or if you are asked about numbers, whether twice 5 is 10, don't you give the same answer now as before? One about things like these, Socrates, I'll always make the same statements, just as you do. But about what is right, I'm quite confident that I have something to say that neither you nor anyone else could contradict. Good heavens! One said, Socrates, this is certainly a valuable discovery you claim to have made, if it will stop jurymen from disagreeing over their verdicts, and ordinary citizens from arguing and litigating and writing about their rights, and stop states from disputing and going to war about theirs. For my part, I don't know how I can tear myself away from you before hearing about this priceless discovery from the man who made it. No, said Hippias, you shan't hear about it until you have told us your view about what is right. You content yourself with making fun of other people by questioning and testing them all, while you won't state your own case or disclose your own opinions to anyone about anything. Why, Hippias, he said, aren't you aware that I never stop revealing what I think is right? One should like to know what this account of yours is. If I don't reveal my views in a formal account, I do so by my conduct. Don't you think that actions are more reliable evidence than words? One much more, of course. People often say what is right and do what is wrong. But nobody can be in the wrong if he is doing what is right. Well then, have you ever known me give false evidence or be a sycophant or stir up trouble between friends or in the state, or do anything else that is? No, I haven't, he said, and refraining from what is wrong is right, don't you think? One can see, Socrates, that you are still trying to avoid explaining what you think right means. You are describing not what right-minded people do, but what they don't do. Well, said Socrates, one should have thought that to refuse to do wrong was a sufficient demonstration of moral rectitude. But if you don't agree, see whether you like this better. I say that what is lawful is right. Do you mean that lawful and right are the same, Socrates? One, yes, I do. One, asked because I don't grasp what you mean by lawful and right. You know what is meant by a country's laws? One asked Socrates, yes. And what do you think they are? What the citizens have recorded after agreement about what they ought to do and what they ought to refrain from. So a law-abiding person would be one who orders his life in the community in accordance with these, and a lawless person one who transgresses them. One, certainly. So a person who obeyed them would be doing what is right, and one who disobeyed them what is wrong? One, certainly. So the person who did what was right would be right, and the one who did wrong would be wrong, of course. Then a law-abiding person is right, and a lawless one wrong. Do you mean that lawful and right are the same, Socrates? One, yes, I do. One, asked because I don't grasp what you mean by lawful and right. You know what is meant by a country's laws? One asked Socrates, yes. And what do you think they are? What the citizens have recorded after agreement about what they ought to do and what they ought to refrain from. So a law-abiding person would be one who orders his life in the community in accordance with these, and a lawless person one who transgresses them. One, certainly. So a person who obeyed them would be doing what is right, and one who disobeyed them what is wrong? One, certainly. So the person who did what was right would be right, and the one who did wrong would be wrong, of course. Then a law-abiding person is right, and a lawless one wrong. Hippias objected, how can one regard laws or obedience to them as a serious thing when the very same people who enacted them often repudiate and alter them? 11, yes, said Socrates, and states often undertake a war and then make peace. Very true. Do you think there is any difference, he said, between your belittling obedience to the laws on the ground that the laws may be repealed, and criticizing good discipline in time of war because peace may be made? Or do you actually find fault with those who help their country wholeheartedly in time of war? One, no, I certainly don't, he said. Are you aware, said Socrates, that Lycurgus, the Lacedaemonian, would have made Sparta no better than any other city if he had not inculcated in it the greatest obedience to the laws? Don't you know that the best leaders are those who are most efficient in making the people obey the laws, and that a city in which the people are most obedient to the laws has the best life in time of peace and is irresistible in war? Moreover, concord is accepted to be the greatest blessing in a state, and very commonly in a state the Senate and aristocracy call upon the citizens to agree. And everywhere in Greece there is a law laid down that the citizens take an oath to agree, and everywhere this oath is taken. I presume that the purpose of this is not that the citizens may come to the same decision about plays, or praise the same musicians, or choose the same poets, or take pleasure in the same things, but that they may obey the laws. For it is when the inhabitants abide by these that countries become strongest and happiest. But without agreement a state cannot be well organized nor an estate well managed, and in private life, how can anyone incur less punishment or more honor from the state than by obeying the laws? How could he be less likely to lose or more likely to win in the courts? To whom would one more confidently entrust one's money or one's sons and daughters? Whom would the state as a whole consider more dependable than the law-abiding man? From whom would parents, relations, servants, friends, fellow countrymen or foreigners be more likely to obtain their rights? To whom would an enemy more readily entrust the making of truces or treaties or terms of peace? To whom would people be more willing to ally themselves than to the law-abiding man? To whom would allies more readily entrust supreme command or the defense of a fortress or the protection of cities? From whom would a benefactor expect to receive more gratitude than from a law-abiding man? Whom would one be more inclined to benefit than a person from whom one anticipates a return of favor? Whom would one wish more to have for a friend, or less to have for an enemy? whom would one be less likely to fight than the man whom one would wish most to be one's friend and least to be one's enemy, and to whom the largest number wish to be friends and allies, and the smallest number enemies and foes? Personally, Hippias, I'll express the view that lawful and right are the same. If you hold the opposite view, please explain it to me. No, really, Socrates, said Hippias, one don't think I do hold the opposite view to yours about what is right. Do you know what is meant by unwritten laws, Hippias? He asked. Yes, those which are observed in every country with respect to the same circumstances. Can you assert that it was men who laid them down? 1. How could it be, considering that they couldn't all meet together and don't speak the same language? 1. And who do you think are the authors of these? 1. Suppose that these laws were ordained for men by gods. At any rate, among all peoples the first established custom is to worship gods. Isn't it a custom everywhere to honor parents? 1. Yes, that too, and that parents should not copulate with their children or children with their parents? 1. Don't think that this is a God-given law like the others, Socrates, because I'll observe that some people break it. In point of fact, they break a good many other laws, but those who transgress the laws laid down by the gods pay a penalty which no man can escape, in the way that some transgressors of man-made laws escape paying the penalty either by escaping detection or by the use of force. What penalty, Socrates, cannot be escaped by parents who copulate with their children or children who copulate with their parents? 1. The greatest of all, I can tell you. What greater misfortune could happen to human beings in the procreation of their children than to procreate badly? 1. Why should they procreate badly, asked Hippias, seeing that there is no reason why the fathers should not be good themselves and beget children by good mothers? 1. Because surely the partners in procreation ought not only to be good, but at their physical prime. Or do you suppose that the seed of those who are in their prime is no different from that of those who have not yet reached it or who have already passed it? 1. No, indeed, he said, they're not likely to be the same. Which is the better, then? 1. Obviously the seed of those who are in their prime, so that of others is not of high quality. It is certainly not likely to be, then one ought not to procreate under these conditions. No, indeed, so those who do so are procreating as they ought not, so. It seems to me, what else could be bad procreation, then, if there's one accept your view about this too? Well now, isn't it customary everywhere to repay benefits? 1. Yes, it is, but this is transgressed too. Don't those who transgress it pay a penalty as well, by being deprived of good friends and being compelled to pursue the company of people who dislike them? Isn't it a fact that those who do good to their associates are good friends, whereas those who don't repay their debts are disliked for their ingratitude, but still try with all their might to form such associations because of the profit to be gained from them? 1. Certainly, Socrates, he said, all this looks like the work of the gods. That the laws themselves should entail penalties for their transgressors seems to me to imply a lawgiver of more than human excellence. Well then, Hippias, do you think that the gods' legislation is right or not? 1. It must be right. It's hard to see how anyone else could lay down what is right if a god couldn't. So it follows, Hippias, that the gods are satisfied that right and lawful mean the same. By this sort of conversation and conduct, he made those who came into contact with him better men. I shall now tell how he made his associates more efficient. Believing that self-discipline was a good thing for anyone to have who intended to achieve a creditable result, in the first place he let his companions see clearly that he himself kept the strictest training that anyone could. And in the second place, in his conversation he used to urge his companions on to self-discipline above all. He was constantly mindful himself, and was always reminding his companions of the things that are conducive to moral goodness. And I know that he once had a discussion about self-discipline with Euthydemus to the following effect. Tell me, Euthydemus, he said, do you think that liberty is a fine and splendid possession both for an individual and for a state? 1. Yes, beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt. If a man is governed by the pleasures of the body and because of them cannot act as is best, do you think that he is a free man? 1. Far from it. Presumably you say that because you think it is the mark of a free man to act in the best way, and consequently to have masters who prevent you from so acting is slavish. Absolutely. So it seems to you that those who have no self-discipline are absolutely slavish. It does indeed. Naturally, do you think that these people are merely prevented from acting in the best way, or that they are actually forced to do the most disgraceful things? 1. In my opinion, they are just as much compelled to do the one as they are prevented from doing the other. And what sort of masters do you think those are who prevent the best actions and compel the worst? 1. Surely the worst possible. And what do you consider to be the worst form of slavery? 1. Think it is slavery under the worst masters, so self-indulgent people endure the worst form of slavery? 1. That is my opinion. Don't you think that self-indulgence debars people from wisdom, which is the greatest good, and drives them into the opposite state? Don't you think that, by dragging them off in pursuit of pleasure, it prevents them from studying and apprehending their real interests? And that it often confuses their perception of good and bad and makes them choose the worse instead of the better? 1. That does happen, and who, Euthydemus, can we say has less concern with self-discipline than the self-indulgent man? For surely the effects of self-discipline and self-indulgence are directly opposed. 1. Admit it too. Do you think that anything is more likely to hinder one from devoting oneself to the proper objects than self-indulgence? I know, I don't. Do you think there is anything worse for a man than that which makes him choose what is bad for him instead of what is good, and persuades him to cultivate the former and disregard the latter, and compels him to behave in the opposite way to that which is adopted by disciplined people? 1. No, nothing. Isn't it likely that self-discipline brings results for those who practice it, which are opposite to those of self-indulgence? I certainly Isn't it also likely that the cause of these opposite results is supremely good? Yes, it is. So doesn't it look as if self-discipline were the best thing for a man? One very likely. Socrates, he said, have you ever reflected on this, Euthydemus? On what? One, the fact that although self-indulgence is supposed to be the sole guide to pleasure, it cannot even take us there itself. It is self-discipline, above all, which causes pleasure. How so? One, self-indulgence doesn't allow us to endure hunger or thirst or sexual desire or sleeplessness, which are the only things that make eating and drinking and sexual intercourse pleasurable, and likewise rest and sleep. It doesn't permit us to hold out and wait for the moment of maximum enjoyment. And consequently it prevents us from getting any appreciable pleasure from the most necessary and regularly recurrent acts. On the other hand, self-discipline, which is the only thing that gives us endurance in the cases I have described, is also the only thing that in these cases gives us any pleasure worth mentioning. What you say is absolutely true. Then again, there is the process of learning something really good, and taking an interest in one of those activities by means of which a man can govern his body well and manage his estate efficiently and make himself useful to his friends and to the state, and get the better of his enemies, activities which offer not only the greatest benefits, but also the greatest pleasures. The self-disciplined practice these activities and enjoy them, but the self-indulgent have no part in any of them. Whom could we call worse qualified for such activities than the man who is least capable of performing them, obsessed as he is by his eagerness for the pleasures that are nearest to hand? It seems to me, Socrates replied, Euthydemus, that you are saying that a man who can't resist physical pleasure is quite incapable of any goodness at all. Yes, Euthydemus, because how can a man without self-discipline be any better than the most ignorant beast? If a person doesn't consider what is best, but tries by every means to do what is most pleasant, how can he be any better than the most senseless animals? Only the self-disciplined have the capacity to consider what are the best objects of action and, by both theoretically and practically categorizing good and bad, to choose the former and abstain from the latter. This was the way, he said, in which people became best and happiest, and also most capable of philosophical discussion. He said that discussion was so called because, when people join together for deliberation, they divide their subject matter into categories. Hence one should try to prepare oneself as fully as possible for this activity, and apply oneself to it above all. For it was through it that people developed the highest qualities of character and leadership, as well as becoming excellent philosophers. I shall now try to describe how Socrates made his associates better at philosophical discussion. He believed that those who understood the nature of any given thing would be able to explain it to others as well, whereas it was no wonder, he said, if those who did not understand made mistakes themselves and misled others. Consequently, he never stopped investigating with the help of his companions the meaning of every single term. It would be a laborious task to describe fully all the distinctions that he drew. I shall mention only a few examples, which I think will serve to illustrate his method of inquiry. First of all, he examined the meaning of piety in some such way as this. Tell me, Euthydemus, he said, what sort of thing do you think religiousness is? 1. A very fine thing, to be sure. Can you say what sort of person a religious man is? 1. One think he is a man who worships the gods. Can one worship the gods in any way one likes? 1. No, there are laws which must be observed in worshipping. Then a person who knows these laws would know how one ought to worship the gods. That is my opinion. Does a man who knows how one ought to worship the gods think that one ought not to worship them in a different way from the way that he knows? 1. Surely. Does anyone worship the gods in a different way from that in which he thinks he ought to worship? 1. Imagine not. So the man who knows what is lawful with regard to the gods is likely to worship them lawfully, certainly. Does the man who worships lawfully worship as he ought? 1. Of course, and the man who worships as he ought is religious? 1. Certainly. So we may take it that the man who knows what is lawful with regard to the gods would be correctly defined as religious. That is how it seems to me. What about people? Is one allowed to treat them just as one likes? 1. No. Here again there are points of law in accordance with which people have to be treated. Do people who treat one another in accordance with these treat one another as they ought? 1. Of course. Do those who treat people as they ought treat them well? Certainly, he said. Do those who treat people well conduct their human affairs well? Presumably, he said. Do those who obey the laws do what is right? Certainly. Do you know what is meant by rightll? What the law commands. So those who do what the law commands do what is right and what they ought to do. Of course, are those who do what is right moral? 1. Presume so. Do you think that any people obey the laws without knowing what the laws command? No, I don't. Do you think that any people who know what they ought to do think that they ought not to do it? 1. Imagine not. Do you know of any people who do things other than what they think they ought? No, I don't. So those who know what is lawful with regard to men do what is right? P. Certainly. Are those who do what is right moral? Yes, who else could be? 1. So we should be correct if we defined moral people as those who know what is lawful with regard to men. 1. Think so, and how can we define wisdom? Tell me, do you think that a wise man is wise in relation to what he knows, or are some people wise in relation to what they don't know? P3. Obviously they are wise in relation to what they know, he replied. How could anyone be wise in relation to what he doesn't know? 1. And are the wise because of their knowledge? 1. What else could make one wise if not knowledge? 1. And do you think that wisdom is anything other than what makes people wise? 1. No, I don't. So wisdom is knowledge. So it seems to me. Do you think that it is possible for a human being to know everything that there is? 1. No, indeed, not even the minutest portion of it, so it isn't possible for a human being to be wise in respect of everything? 1. No, certainly not. Then every man is wise only in respect of that which he knows, so it seems to me. So shall we also investigate goodness, Euthydemus, starting as follows? 11. How? He asked. Do you think that the same thing is beneficial to everyone? 1. No, I don't you think, in fact, that what is beneficial to one person is sometimes harmful to another? 1. Do indeed. Would you say that good is different from beneficial? No. So what is beneficial is good for anyone to whom it is beneficial. 1. Think so. Can we give any different account of fineness? Can you name a fine body or article or anything else which you know to be fine for all purposes? 1. No, indeed I can't. He said, is it proper to use everything for the purpose for which it is useful? Certainly. Is a thing fine for any purpose other than that for which it is proper to use it? 1. No, in relation to nothing else. So what is useful is fine for the purpose for which it is useful. So it seems to me. Next, courage, Euthydemus, do you think that it is a fine thing? 11. One should say that it is a very fine thing. You don't consider, then, that courage is useful for the most trivial things? 1. On the contrary, he said, for the most important things. Does it seem to you that it is useful in relation to dangers and perils to be unaware of them? 1. Not at all. So those who are not afraid of such things because they don't So those who are not afraid of such things because they don't know what they are not brave? 1. No, indeed. On that basis a great many lunatics and cowards would be brave. What about those who fear even what is not dangerous? 1. Surely, they are even less brave. Then do you consider that those who are good in relation to perils and dangers are brave, and those who are bad in relation to them are cowardly? 1. Certainly. Do you think that anyone is good at these things apart from those who can deal with them well? No, only those. And the bad are those who are of the kind to deal with them badly. Yes, who else? 1. Do both types deal with them as they think they should? Yes, how else? 1. Do those who can't deal with them well know how they ought to deal with them? Of course not, so those who know how they ought to deal with them also have the ability to deal with them. Yes, and they are the only ones who have. Well now, do those who are not completely mistaken deal with these situations badly? 1. Think not, he said, so it is those who deal with them badly that are completely mistaken? 1. Presumably. So those who know how to deal well with dreadful and dangerous situations are brave, and those who are completely mistaken are cowardly? 1. So it seems to me, he said, Socrates considered that kingship and despotism were both forms of authority, but differed from each other. He thought that authority with the consent of the people and in accordance with the laws of the state was kingship, whereas authority without consent and in accordance not with the laws but with the whim of the ruler was despotism. Where offices were filled by men who satisfied the legal requirements, he considered the constitution to be an aristocracy. Where they were filled in accordance with the property qualification, a plutocracy. And where they were filled by anybody, a democracy, if anyone was arguing with him about something and had nothing definite to say, but claimed, without proof, that the person he was talking about was the wiser or more statesmanlike or more courageous or superior in some other such quality. Socrates used to refer the whole argument back to first principles in this sort of way. Do you maintain that the person you are praising is a better citizen than mine? 1. Yes, I do. Then hadn't we better first consider what is the function of a good citizen? 1. Let's do that. If it were a matter of financial administration, wouldn't the better man be the one who increased the public revenue? 1. Certainly. And in war he would be the one who gave his country the upper hand over its opponents? 1. Of course, and in diplomacy the man who makes friends instead of enemies? 1. Naturally. Then in politics he is the one who stops civil strife and creates a spirit of unity? 1. So it seems, Tome, when the argument was referred back to first principles in this way, the truth became apparent to his opponents too. And when he himself was setting out a detailed argument, he used to proceed by such stages as were generally agreed, because he thought that this was the infallible method of argument. Consequently, when he was talking, he used to win the agreement of his audience more than anyone else that I have known. He used to say that Homer himself attributed to Odysseus the quality of being an infallible speaker, because he could base his arguments on the accepted beliefs of his hearers. It is obvious, I think, from the foregoing account, that Socrates used to reveal his opinions candidly to his companions. I shall now show that he also tried to ensure that they should be self-sufficient in their appropriate activities. Of all the people that I have known, he was the most concerned to know the extent of any of his associates' special knowledge, and the most enthusiastic to teach, so far as he was competent, the subjects which a truly good man should know. And where he himself was not well qualified, he put them in touch with experts. He also instructed them how far a properly educated person should be informed about each subject. For example, he thought that geometry should be learned so far as to enable one, if the occasion arose, to receive or convey or apportion land accurately in point of measurement, or to carry out a task. This, he said, was so easy to learn that a man who applied his mind to the calculation could at one and the same moment know the extent of the ground and carry away the knowledge of how it was measured. But he deprecated taking the learning of geometry as far as figures which are difficult to comprehend. He said that he didn't see the use of them although he was not unacquainted with them, and he said that these studies were capable of wasting a man's life and keeping him from learning many other useful things. He told them to become acquainted also with astronomy, but here again only so far as to be able to recognize the time of night or month or year, so that by distinguishing their phases they might have evidence to use for a journey or a voyage or guard duty, or for any other business that is carried out during a night or month or year. This too, he said, was easy to learn from night hunters and pilots and many others whose business it was to know such things. But to learn astronomy to the extent of even acquiring a knowledge of bodies moving in different orbits, such as the planets and other irregularly moving bodies, and to wear oneself out with trying to discover their distances from the Earth and their paths and the causes of these from this, he vigorously tried to dissuade them. He said that in these studies too he saw no utility, although he was not uninstructed in them either. And they too, he said, could waste a man's life and keep him from much that was profitable in general. He dissuaded them from concerning themselves with the way in which God regulates the various heavenly bodies. 1. He thought that these facts were not discoverable by human beings, and he did not consider that a man would please the gods if he pried into things that they had chosen not to reveal. He said that a person who bothered about these things would run the risk of going just as crazy as Anaxagoras, who prided himself enormously on his exposition of the workings of the gods. When Anaxagoras said that fire and the sun were identical, he was failing to take into account the fact that men can easily look at fire, but cannot fix their gaze upon the sun. And that exposure to the sun makes their skins darker, but exposure to fire does not. He failed also to take into account the fact that no plant can grow properly without sunlight, whereas all plants die when they are heated by fire. And when he said that the sun was a red-hot stone, he also failed to appreciate the fact that, if a stone is placed in a fire, it neither shines nor persists for any length of time, whereas the sun remains all the time the brightest of all things. Socrates recommended the study of arithmetic. But here too, just as in the case of the other subjects, he told his companions to guard against purposeless research. And he himself helped them in their investigations and explanations only so far as was useful. He also strongly encouraged his companions to be careful about their health, and not only to learn all that they could about it from those who knew, but also to study their own constitutions throughout life to see what food or drink or what kind of exercise was good for them individually, and by what use of these they could live the healthiest lives. He said that anyone who observed himself in this way would find it hard to discover a doctor who could recognize what was good for his health better than he could himself. 3. If anyone wanted help beyond the resources of human wisdom, he advised him to take up divination. A man who knew the means by which the gods communicated to men about events, he said, was never in lack of divine counsel. If anyone thinks that Socrates was convicted of making a false claim about the divine because he was condemned to death by the jury even although he claimed that the divine communicated to him in advance what he ought and ought not to do, 1. Let him reflect, first, that Socrates was already so far advanced in age that he would soon have reached the end of his life, even if he had not done so then. And second, that he escaped the most disagreeable part of life, in which everybody's intellect deteriorates, and instead of this displayed his strength of mind and won distinction by pleading his cause with unparalleled veracity, dignity and integrity, and by facing the death sentence with the utmost serenity and fortitude. It is generally agreed that no one in the memory of man has ever met his death more nobly. He had to live on for 30 days after his trial, because the festival of Delos fell in that month, and the law does not permit any publicly sanctioned execution until the mission has returned from Delos. It was evident to his intimate friends that during this time he did not deviate at all from his former way of life, and he had previously been remarkable above all men for the cheerfulness and equanimity of his life. How could anyone die more nobly than this? What death could be nobler than death most nobly accepted? What death could be more happy than the noblest? And who could be more beloved of the gods than the happiest? I shall relate also what I heard about him from Hermogenes the son of Hipponicus. He said that, after Meletus had already laid his indictment, he heard Socrates discussing anything rather than the trial and told him that he ought to be considering his defense. At first Socrates said, "Don't you think that my whole life has been a preparation for it?" 1. And when Hermogenes asked him how, he replied that he had spent all his time in studying nothing but questions of right and wrong, doing what was right and refraining from what was wrong. And he considered that this was the finest preparation for a defense. Then Hermogenes tried another tack. "Don't you see, Socrates, that the jurors at Athens have often before now been prevailed upon by argument to put innocent men to death and to acquit guilty ones?" 1. Yes, but as a matter of fact, Hermogenes, he said, when I was trying to consider my defense before the jury, the divine opposed me straight away. "That's remarkable," said Hermogenes. Socrates answered, "Do you think it's remarkable that God should decide that it is better for me to end my life now? Don't you realize that up to now I would not have conceded to anyone that he had lived a better or more pleasant life than L? For I believe that the best life is lived by those who take the best care to make themselves as good as possible, and the pleasantest life by those who are most conscious that they are becoming better. Up to the present time I have felt that this was happening to me, and, in my contacts with other people and in comparing myself with others, I have invariably come to this conclusion about myself, and not only I, but my friends have always come to this conclusion, not because they love me, because if that were all, everyone who is fond of someone else would come to the same conclusion about his friends, but because they believe that they are likely to improve most by associating with me. But if I go on living, I shall probably have to pay the penalties of old age. My vision, hearing and intelligence will become impaired. I shall become in consequence slower to learn and more forgetful, and inferior to those to whom I used to be superior. Now, even if one were unconscious of this, life would not be worth living. And when one is conscious of it, surely it must make one's life worse and more disagreeable. Then again, if I am wrongly executed, this may be discreditable to those who wrongly put me to death, because if it is shameful to do wrong, it is surely shameful to do anything wrongly. But what disgrace is it to me if other people fail to decide or act rightly? With regard to me, I see also that the reputation left to posterity by the dead is not the same for the doers as for the sufferers of wrong. I know that, even if I die now, people will regard me and those who put me to death in different lights. For I know that it will always be testified of me that I never wronged anybody or made anybody a worse person, but always tried to make my associates better people. This was what he said in conversation with Hermogenes and the rest. Of those who knew what Socrates was like, all who have virtue as their goal continue still to miss him more than anything, because they feel that he was their greatest help in the cultivation of virtue. In my experience, Socrates was, as I have described him, so devout that he never did anything without the sanction of the gods. So upright that he never did the slightest harm to anybody, but conferred the greatest benefits upon those who associated with him. So self-disciplined that he never chose the more pleasant course instead of the better. So wise that he never made a mistake in deciding between better and worse, and needed no advice, but was self-sufficient for such decisions. He was capable of explaining and defining such matters, and capable moreover of both assessing and refuting errors and encouraging people towards virtue and true goodness. In view of these qualities, he seemed to me to be the perfect example of goodness and happiness. If anyone disapproves of this assessment, let him compare other people's characters with these qualities, and then make his own decision. The Dinner Party, translated by Hugh Tredenick, translation revised and introduced by Robin Waterfield.